Excellent. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Canadian Council for the Americas Alberta Economic Outlook in the Americas. And today is January 19 of January of 2021, and we are very excited, and we welcome everybody that is joining us. And we're going to be joined for more people during the day as well, during this morning. So my name is Miguel Cortines, and I'm the President and Executive Director of the Canadian Council for the Americas Alberta. CCA Alberta has been in business for almost 30 years, and we are basically promoting more understanding of what Latin America means for Canadian business. This is our first event of this year, of 2021, and we are very excited to have all the speakers today and the presentations that we are going to receive. Today, we have the participation of Alberto Calva with SMPS Professional Services, that is our corporate sponsors as well of this morning event. We're going to have Thiago de Aragao with the Center for Strategic and International Studies with offices in Washington, Brazil, and other parts of the world. John Padilla and David Bob with IPD Latin America. They are based in Colombia and Spain. Sergio Guzman with Colombia Risk Analysis in Bogotá. Guyana with IHS Market based in Houston. Natalia Sippersout with the Canada-Guyana Chamber of Commerce based in Guyana. Anand Harihal with Global Affairs Canada based in Guyana as well. Leonardo Beltran with the Institute of the Americas and the Sustainable Energy for All Foundation, and Eric Farnsworth with the Council of the Americas and the Americas Society in Washington, D.C. Today with me as well is Karen Fosado with Rainmaker Global Business Development, and Damaris Zampini with Strategy. Damaris and Karen are also moderators for this panel, and they are part of the board members of the CCA Alberta. So, as I mentioned, this is our first activity of 2021, and we want to do this event very interactive. So, try to participate as much as possible. You can use the chat in the screen if you want to present a question for the speakers in general or for a particular speaker. And you can use also the option of raise hands. If we have time, depending on the timing, we have a very tight agenda, but you can use the raise hand, and probably we can open the mic for you. Roger Machado is helping us in the back. Thank you, Roger. He's also part of our board of directors. And okay, so some of the main aspects that we will be discussing today are basically the social, economical, and political aspects that are happening in Latin America, and all the consequences and effects that they're having the relationship with Canada. As we know, we are facing different situations with the pandemic, different challenges for companies that want to invest and do business in Latin America. So today we decided to focus in some specific countries. We are going to touch today Brazil, Colombia, Guyana, Mexico, Venezuela, and we will have a keynote presentation about the new U.S. administration with the new administration of the U.S. Some of the aspects that we should reflect today, it might include how deep has COVID-19 affected the region, how much are governments investing or spending to activate their economies. Will the private and public sectors will be able to raise productivity after the post-pandemic? How the environmental, social, and governance factors are influencing the way of doing business in Latin America? How long it will take for the economies in Latin America to recover? How strong or how vulnerable these economies will be? How digital transformation will affect the region and the way of doing business? What type of new opportunities might arise as a result of the pandemic, and in which sectors of opportunity? And overall, we need to consider that we still have the risk of uncertainty. With that, I would like to pass the voice to Mr. Alberto Calva. He's partner at SMPS Professional Services, or corporate sponsor, who will be providing some introductory remarks. Welcome, Alberto.
Good morning, everybody. Nice to be here with all of you. And with these opening remarks, let me just give a general idea of what I would say we have to think right now if we think about the region. And I would say three things, because this is certainly an uncertain year. We're coming from a not common year, 2020, and this is an uncertain year. And I would say three things. One has to do with COVID, one has to do with the expected gross domestic product growth in the region and per country. And at last, what are the expected political issues that we'll have in each country during these days. So first of all, if we talk about COVID, deaths per every 100,000 people, just general idea, the deaths per every 100,000 people are an average 27 in the world, 27. The country with the largest number is Italy, 136. It's actually not Italy. There are three countries with more deaths, but they are small countries. So I'll say Italy is the number one. But let's take these two numbers, 136 and 27, which is the average in the world. And how are we as a region? Okay, the USA is the first one with 122. It's the worst case, 122. Then Peru, 121. Mexico, 112. Argentina, 102. Brazil, 100. Colombia, 98. Chile, 93. So these countries, these selected list, we are between 122, the highest the US, and 93 Chile. Where is Canada? Canada has only 49 cases. We're above the world average, but we are almost 1/3 of the dead people of COVID than the US. If we go to the gross domestic product, let me talk about what we are expecting based on the OECD numbers. That will be the growth of the gross domestic product, accumulated growth for 2019, 2020, and 2021. Why not only 2021? Because 2021, there could be a big growth rate, but if you come from a fall in 2020, it will not tell you much. And then there are countries that have been in recession since 2020, since 2019. So we go to this way, look at this. If we accumulate the growth of these 3 years, 2019, 2020, and 2021. In the US, we expect a growth of 5%. In Chile, 1.9%. In Canada, 1.5%. And those three countries from this selected list are the only positive rates. Then Brazil, we expect -0.4%. In Colombia, -2% accumulated in 3 years. Mexico, -6.2%. And Argentina, -11.6%. Let's remember that Mexico and Argentina have been in recession since 2019. And last but not least, let's not forget about political things that, or political issues that will be taking place this year. First of all, obviously, the US, tomorrow, it's the inauguration of the new president. I always said that the issue with Trump was going to get to an end on January the 6th. It didn't, so we still don't know what's going to happen. The Trump effect is probably going to still be alive, and we don't know what changes Biden is going to do. So let's wait for that. I understand Peru will have elections in April, Mexico in June, which are very important because that's half of the Congress is going to be renewed. Argentina, October, Chile, November, and Brazil and Colombia, 22. And Canada, obviously, we always have a potential election. So this is more or less the scenario where we are located as a continent right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alberto, and thank you very much to SMPS Professional Service. Can you briefly, just 1 minute, to explain what SMPS services provides? What kind of services?
Yes, thank you. SMPS Professional Services, we're a multidisciplinary firm, and we offer legal, financial, and general all types of services. And one of the things that we do is we help investors and companies coming into Canada.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you for the support for this event. And with that, I would like to introduce Damari Sampini, she's going to moderate our next session that is focused on Brazil. And we are having, well, I don't know if Thiago is already here in the conversation, but Damaris, welcome to this.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you everybody for being on this call today. A lot to learn. I'm very much looking forward to it. I don't know if I've seen Thiago on here yet.
I don't see it yet.
Maybe he can raise his hand, or no, I don't see him on the list unless. No, I don't see him. I am happy to introduce him though, or did you want to maybe switch it up and move to the next speaker for now?
Thiago is going to be our main speaker for Brazil. So let me just try to reach Thiago and see what happened. Okay, give me 1 second, okay? Excellent. I think Thiago is having some problems to connect, but probably, John is offering if we can start with Colombia. Probably if Sergio and John, if you are ready, we can start with the conversation on Colombia.
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome, awesome. John, are you ready for that?
Yes. Hello.
Awesome.
Good morning.
Perfect. Okay, well, I just want to briefly, everybody received the bios and we circulate the bios of everybody. I know we are not going to read the bios, but I just want to thank you, John Padilla with IPD Latin America based on Colombia, very successful firm in doing research and analysis on all items in Latin America. And also Sergio Guzman with Colombia Risk Analysis based in Bogotá. You're in Bogotá, Sergio, right?
Yes, I am.
Awesome, awesome. And well, thank you very much. And I think we are going to learn. John, I left to you because you are going to help us to lead this session.
Okay, well, fantastic. We thought that we would kind of undertake much more of just a conversation piece here. Sergio is definitely much more of the political expert. I mean, Sergio, why don't we do this? I mean, if you could maybe just kind of, start us out with kind of an overview, some of the things that you're seeing, what we've seen here in 2020, and then kind of a prospect of what we can expect in 2021, and then we can just kind of start to engage and have a little more interactive conversation.
Absolutely, John. Well, thank you again. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I'm Sergio Guzman. I'm the Director of Colombia Risk Analysis. 2020 was a really bad year for Colombia. It was supposed to be the year to make it or break it for Colombia because, as many of you remember, in 2019, President Duque had passed significant tax relief bill. And in this bill, there was a lot of tax reductions for corporations, which was expected to entice a lot of investors to invest in Colombia in 2020. So it was supposed to be Colombia's, debutante year, and it ended to be anything but. We saw some people estimate 7.7 economic contraction. What we saw was very unhappy body politic, very unhappy people. Although Duque's approval ratings went up, that's not surprising because the government had a significant subsidy program to help people go through the pandemic. But that hasn't necessarily meant with an end of social unrest, an end of dissatisfaction, and already people, particularly people in his own party, looking ahead and trying to look beyond Duque and trying to establish narratives for 2022, which, as Alberto mentioned, is the year when Colombia is going to have presidential and elections for Congress. And so what we're seeing, at least politically speaking, is the government improved its cooperation with the Congress in the sense that it appointed and named more people belonging to different parties, to different government posts, such as healthcare, agriculture, interior, etc. And I think that that's positive in the sense that it has created a new dynamic between the government and the Congress, but that doesn't necessarily mean that this will transcend, over the next year into very solid policy making or ability to pass significant regulatory packets. Because there are three very notable things, and I think they're important for the energy sector in particular, because rating agencies have already said, unless Colombia improves its revenue position, they're going to downgrade. And the question of a Colombia downgrade has been on the cards for a while, but the question now is when, as opposed to if it's going to happen. And so I think everybody who's attending this call should pay attention, or should at least price in a potential downgrade of Colombia sovereign debt, but also all of the attached issues. And so to address this, the Colombian government really has to do two things. And I see here both risks and opportunities. They either have to raise revenue through increased taxation, something that they've flirted with in the past. And of course, it's not the most politically convenient thing to do, ahead of an electoral season, or two, potentially sell some stakes in government companies. And I think in this sense, the government is going to look at this plan B as a more potentially politically palatable opportunity to get rid of some government assets. And unsurprisingly, Ecopetrol, the government's 8.5 stake in Ecopetrol, is still there. I just want to clarify, the government has an 88.9% stake in Ecopetrol, and regulations have it that the Colombian government always has to have above 80% participation. So that 8.5% is on the chopping block for that reason. And it doesn't have to go through Congress. They don't have to pass a bill. It could very well be. Ecopetrol subsidiaries can also be on the chopping block. More than 22 different hydroelectric companies, as well as Interconexión Eléctrica S.A., ISA, are on the chopping block. So potentially a lot of acquisition material in Colombia in 2021, and investors are going to find a very needy government. The government is in a needy position as it needs to sell. So politically speaking, I just want to change gears. Everybody's trying to look at what happens with the Congress in 2022, because the Congress has two options. They either go along and play along with the government, in which case they might see themselves passing some pretty unpopular regulation, such as this tax reform, potentially pension reform, potentially labor reform, and catch electors in a bad mood next year, or they can just decide not to play ball and begin distancing themselves from the government. In which case, we may find a much more obtuse policy-making environment, much more considering much more congressional delays, procedural delays, etc., which doesn't necessarily bode well, but it doesn't also change up the whole entire landscape. And so I think these are a couple of things that I keep in mind. In terms of security, there's a worsening of security conditions in rural areas that I think all investors, particularly in oil and gas, need to pay attention to. Not to say that the entire country's risk panorama has worsened, but I think it's going to be important to understand particular assets and the likelihood that they may, confront certain risks going forward. So I'd advise you, if you're looking at investing in Colombia, to just pay attention really well to what areas of the country you're interested in and how that meets with your risk appetite specifically. I think socially this year is going to be a little different than last year, because last year people were genuinely afraid of protesting and they were waiting for triggers. In 2019, we had some very significant protests at the end of November that many people expected 2020 was the year when they would continue to cast shadow on the government's ability to transcend. But of course, we had COVID-19, which forced a lot of people not to turn out. And they did when the triggers were present. So when the police acted with excessive force against certain citizens, there were protests, but that doesn't mean that there were very significant, large, potentially significant protests in 2020. I think in 2021, that outlook may change more significantly, because people are much more fatigued with the pandemic. The economic situation for low-income households has worsened significantly, despite the government subsidies that I mentioned earlier, which, by the way, expire in June, and we're expecting that they'll be resumed. But I think the social situation is going to look a little trickier in 2021 than it did in 2020. So just to lay out the groundwork, John, I know we have a lot to talk about, but I think those are some of the main issues.
No, perfect. Yeah, I think, what I'd contribute to that is simply that the Colombian model has worked very well as long as there's been substantial economic growth. And so, I mean, if you take a look over the past 20 years, it's averaged, I think, 3.81%. And so the decline that we're going to see this year, 7 to 8%, is problematic in itself. But then the question is what is the ability to rebound? And I think there's two things that are things that people really need to take a look at. One is unemployment. And so unemployment hit, I think 20% in July. I think it's down to about a little over 13%, but it's not going away. And I think what that really speaks to is the fact that Colombia needs to, it's at a tipping point. It needs to pivot. It needs to be able to essentially create domestic economic activity. This, like a lot of other Latin American countries, has been extremely export driven. So everything from oil commodities to coffee, as well as illegal substances as well. So the point is that the country is really at a flexion point where it's got to decide what it's going to do. And to be able to address unemployment, you've got to create that kind of economic activity locally. And I think it really came through here during the pandemic, because Colombians, it's a consumption-based economy, and people are used to going to the centros comerciales, to the shopping centers, and all of that then stopped. And the reality is that the online infrastructure was not really there. It's been improving, but when you take a look at that, there's still a lot of impediments for the country to move forward. So that starts with the banking sector, as well as then some of the infrastructure. And those are things that, quite frankly, I don't think we've heard a whole heck of a lot about, but I think are going to be really vital as we move forward. The other thing that I want to bring up is, the role of the energy sector, because the energy sector is been basically a fundamental part of the economy. But I think a lot of people lose sight exactly to what extent. And so now that we're talking about clean energy and energy transition, what does that mean for Colombia? And so there's clear efforts that are being undertaken by the government, but the reality is that oil exports still represent 30% of all exports of the country. It's gone down, but 30% is still really high. But the factor that is absolutely more critical is in terms of foreign direct investment. And the reason that it's critical is because it has been, the foreign direct investment has been paying something like 70% of the current account deficit. And the current account deficit, particularly with a country that has been deficit spending for a number of years, is a big issue. So if, as the country is looking to transition, it still has to keep oil and gas, it still has to keep commodities to keep the whole mix going on. So, as Sergio was saying, you have two ratings. You have you basically have Fitch and S&P at BBB minus, so at the bottom rung of investment grade ratings, but with negative outlooks. And then you have Moody's one notch above at Baa2, but also with the negative outlook. So everybody's hyper concerned about the debt burden that Colombia has, and the expectation is that in 2021 Colombia will go into a range of debt to GDP anywhere between 60 to 67%, depending on the different sources that you're taking a look at. That then will really put tremendous pressure, even though countries across the world have all gone with debt to higher GDP ratings. Obviously, the big concern globally is interest rates and what happens there. But the point is that Colombia's debt burden is a big, big issue. And so the big challenge for this year, from a macro perspective, from a government perspective, is absolutely going to be addressing that. Maybe it'd be an interesting point to just kind of talk about, some of the new areas that the government is looking to pursue. I mean, when this administration came in, the whole orange economy was touted. The reality is that hasn't really kind of changed, much of anything in terms of GDP. There's now a lot of talk about nearshoring, but what's your take, Sergio, on some of those issues? And let me throw in one other piece, which is I think fundamental, and that is just vested interest. During the middle of this past year, Duque's ratings fell, I think, as low as 20%. They're now, as you were alluding to, have come back up. He's engaged in the same thing, quite frankly, that he said that he was opposed to, the mermelada in Colombia. But let's face it. I mean, that's the political dynamics that we have in Colombia, and it's been effective. It's been important. But does he have enough clout to then start pushing against some of the vested interests in different areas? Because everybody right now is kind of going like this. It's like your area, not my area. So maybe some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, John, I think you hit the nail on the head. But looking at the sectors, I think one thing is unequivocal, which is last year was so bad. This year, all sectors are going to present growth. Probably supermarkets and grocers are going to present less growth than they did before, just because of the inertia of things. But I think all sectors are going to grow as when compared to last year's number. And so I think that's a positive outlook, so to speak. But I also think that the government set its eyes on infrastructure, like you mentioned, not just closing the majority of the 4G projects that were left by the Santos administration, but also trying to come up with new infrastructure, large new infrastructure projects, ports, railroads. We saw, for instance, the Bogotá Metro is already underway. The Regiotram is already underway. Potential sales, even of Canadian assets such as Continental Gold in Buritica was important. But this year we could maybe see more focus in the mining sector. And in mining, how it's concerning to energy is important because Colombia has 3 very large coal mines in the north, in Cesar and La Guajira, and investors for all those 3 mines, BHP, Glencore, and Anglo American, have all signaled that they're interested in exiting. So is Drummond. So Colombia may potentially receive some foreign direct investment in the form of an acquisition by a mining company. And so, of course, look out for potential tax revenues that may generate and whatnot. But I do think that the government's not in a position to be overly critical or very stingy with requirements. And so I think right now this government's priorities are to get as much investment as soon as we can to get the economy going back again. And so in that sense, nearshoring is a potential opportunity for Colombia. The Biden administration, just as the Trump administration, is going to have that contentious stance on China. I don't think that that's a major difference between the 2 administrations. How they go about it is going to be different, but I do think companies are going to look at Colombia as a potential opportunity. Of course, Mexico is closer, and Mexico has both a legal, labor, and infrastructure proximity to the United States that makes it a more appropriate destination. But Colombia is going to try to look to compete with Brazil and Mexico for those nearshoring opportunities. Now, the biggest question is if we're going to be able to reform our labor laws and our tax regulations sufficiently to make Colombia an enticing opportunity for investors in those countries. That's why when I talk about potential labor reform, I don't mean it in the hypothetical. I do mean it in the very real sense that this could create a selling point for these companies looking to engage in nearshoring. So I think that those, to answer your questions very directly, I think that those are the places where Duque is going to focus. In the last 18 months, he has as president. And, Duque looks much more like the lame duck president than any other president in this point of their presidency. The final year and a half is not really the year, it's the year for legacy building, right? That's why, for instance, some of the issues that Duque is looking at on anti-corruption, on our ability to enact transformative legislation. I think that was more during the first 2 years, and unfortunately that ship has sailed.
Yeah, no, and that brings up a good point on COP26. But before we go there, I think one project that's probably worth keeping on everybody's radar, and it's been the on again, off again project, is Buenaventura LNG. And so it's interesting because the transportation costs to bring gas from essentially Cusiana over to Cali they're exorbitant. They're cost prohibitive. So I mean, you're literally looking at something like $10, $12 an MMBTU. So the case for Buenaventura LNG as a concept, I think, is really interesting. Clearly, there in the Valle de Cauca, people are very interested because they're interested in the employment potential that it'll bring. And certainly it has good optionality in terms of then bringing a lot of nearshoring and perhaps some of the technology and things that President Duque is very much trying to encourage. I think the disconnect right now is the size. I mean, it's kind of like it needs to be this size, and the market is saying, well, we're not sure that that's exactly what the market will support. The other factor, I think, is El Nino. And so El Nino has become much more severe each and every time. And the reality is that those hydro prices are spiking. And if you're able to get competitively priced gas in there, at least by some of the analysis that we've done, you could actually start competing even head to head, which is almost blasphemy for a lot of people to hear. But the reality is that it'll create a lot of diversity of supply and redundancy. And that's reliability, redundancy are things on the electrical side that absolutely support what it is that Duque has been trying to do in terms of internet rollout, in terms of creating a much more interconnected kind of country. So there's still a lot of steps ahead. I mean, we'll see if 400 million cubic feet per day. It just requires a lot of offtake, and then there's a lot of people or the parties that could take that offtake are going to be slightly reluctant. But it's going to be something to watch for, because it's the kind of major infrastructure project that could be really game changing. Because once you gasify the west coast of Colombia, it opens up tremendous possibilities in terms of business and economic activity. So if that's what the government is looking for, it may need to sharpen its pencils a little bit, and we'll see exactly what happens as this bid kind of moves forward. I think it might be an interesting pivot point. You brought up kind of legacy building, Sergio, and Duque has said that he's going to present at COP26. Clearly there's been a big push under this administration, and by Duque's words, renewables will go from something like 0.2% of the mix, and that's non-hydro, obviously, because this is a 70% hydro dominated electric market, but a non-hydro 0.2% up to 14% by the end of his administration. And so he's got a deforestation plan for the Amazon. And maybe, because I think you know this fairly well, Sergio, maybe you could articulate a little bit of what that's about and what we might be able to expect in terms of leading up to COP26 and then and after.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, John, I think part of the reason why the government became so bullish on renewables was because of the issue we had with Hidroituango, and not being able to deliver on Hidroituango, which is supposed to start producing energy for the country in 2023, which very, like you said, matches up with El Nino, or at least, in terms of the forecasts, right? If the government's not able to, or the engineering companies and EPM aren't able to bring Hidroituango online, the government's going to have to depend much more on renewables. And the project that we're looking at for renewables is the Colectora energy transmission line that connects Jepirachi and the Guajira province, which is where many of these projects are centered, with the rest of the country. But to get that done, there needs to be more than 5,000 prior consultations with indigenous communities. So the question is, if indigenous communities are going to play ball, which they really haven't in the past, or if indigenous communities are going to try to delay this to extract as many rents as they can from the Grupo Energía de Bogotá, which is the company that's running this transmission line. So I do think that the government's trying to push this along and is trying to be as generous as it can, because it understands that there's huge downside risks for not having done that. And so in that regard, I think the government has tried to, and look, I don't think that the government has an environmental track record that is poor. I think the country has an environmental track record that's poor, and just the inertia of things just put Duque in this path where deforestation, particularly in the Amazonian region, has gone out of hand. And this is something that's happening in Brazil, and my colleague Thiago is going to speak more about this, I presume. But to really get a hold of deforestation, the government is not about narco trafficking. Of course, there's a component of narco trafficking involved in deforestation, but a much larger component of deforestation is cattle ranching. And so the question is, and you mentioned vested interest before, John, and I'll segue to that, because a lot of the people that are engaged in cattle ranching are very important vested interests politically and very aligned with President Duque's political party. So being able to head on confront deforestation is going to be a much more onerous challenge than at least Duque is letting to know. Because at the moment, the government says we're going to plant 180 million trees by 2020 goal. I don't know how the reporting on that is going, but you can't solve deforestation by decree. You can't solve deforestation by holding trilateral or multilateral meetings in the Amazon. So there needs to be a place where the rubber meets the road. And I think the issue here is prosecution of people who deforest. And to do that successfully and present something actually beyond words at COP26, I think the government's going to have to get its act together on the prosecution of people carrying out deforestation. I do think a lot of energy companies can participate as part of their social corporate responsibility in some of these efforts to either plant native trees, generate ecotourism and agroecological sustainable initiatives. And I think this is a huge opportunity to promote that ESG financing that we've all heard about for so long. So I wouldn't say it's all risks in terms of the environmental side. I do think that there's a huge potential upside if players are able to capitalize it.
Yeah, no, perfect. I think we're, what do we have, Miguel, like 5 minutes thereabouts?
We are at 9:30, but yeah, we can start to wrap up basically.
Okay.
But I have a question for both of you, probably. Just try to see, how do you see Colombia as an opportunity for Canadian companies after COVID, right? With the digital transformation, how the country is going to be changed, right? All the countries are changed in some way. But where do you see the major opportunities for Canadian companies in a new Colombia, in a new era after COVID with digital transformation? You mentioned right now, Sergio, the importance of the ESG, the environmental, social governance aspects, and how Canadian companies can take advantage of doing business with Colombia.
Yeah, Miguel, I think there's so much potential in that sense. Canadian companies across the gamut invest in Colombia, not just huge financial firms like Scotiabank, but also pension funds like the Ontario Teachers Pension Funds, and also CDPQ and other investment, other very large institutional investors play a role in Colombia, both in terms of energy, but also in terms of financial assets, which I think are very important for Colombia going forward. Canada has also looked into the orange economy and cultural sectors, which I think is of huge potential. Tourism is also very, very big, not just from Canada to Colombia, which is a major source, but also students from Colombia to Canada, which is a very important revenue source for Canadian universities and higher education institutions. So I think that that's one of the places where both governments are going to try to focus on, trying to get new flights. There's now a direct flight from Quebec from Montreal to Bogotá. I don't know how the frequencies, but the issue here is I think Canada and Colombia are developing and forging a much closer partnership. At the same time, I do think that the bulk of Canadian investment to Colombia continues to be in the extractive sector. Let's not lose our eye on the ball here, because I do think Canadian companies, particularly from Alberta, are closely engaged in Colombia. And Canada has some social, environmental, and governance safeguards that can be significantly important for Colombian communities, different mayoralties in Colombia, different governorships in Colombia, and I think that partnership can grow. I think the Canadian Embassy in Colombia is trying to do that job quite largely. I'd like to answer, John, or maybe you can touch on this question that's here live, because I think you have much more insights than I do into this.
Yeah. So yeah, I thought that I'd pivot a little bit more to the energy sector and the oil and gas and pick up on some of the themes that Sergio mentioned. The reality is that the government is going to be hard pressed to, even though they've said that they will not sell assets, push comes to shove, it probably becomes the path of least resistance. And the dynamics in the oil and gas space are that Ecopetrol has done as well as the sector has done a phenomenal job in terms of EOR to date to maintain reserves, but reserves are down at I think 5.6, 5.8 years. And when we've charted out what that decline is likely to look like next year based off of oil price declines and comparing it to what happened the last time that we had oil price declines, it's probably going to fall somewhere in the range of about 5.3 years. So, and gas is a little bit better, but not much. I mean, these are all sub 10, 10-year numbers, which is really pretty disconcerting. So the point is that EOR is not going to be able to continue to kind of pull the weight that it has in the past, and the reality is that the ANH and Ecopetrol bid rounds, they're just really small fry, and it's complicated, particularly when you have oil prices that are this low, because the issues, the challenges that you have in Colombia is transportation, and then a lot of the oil it's evacuation. So it's the oil tends to be much heavier, and so the discount that you get off of Brent then really squeezes your margins. So when you're doing small production, you're just really beholden to so many other different parties and factors that you can't control. And in this kind of environment where you see a global push towards just the creme de la creme of activity, that's going to be a very, very difficult push. So the two pieces, and I think this really, this gets to the question that Benigno is asking. Nice to hear from you, Benigno. Is basically offshore and then unconventionals. So on offshore, the challenge thus far has been that the discoveries have been very deep. Thus far, they've been gassy. It's encouraging. I mean, the exception to that is Orca, which Ecopetrol is looking to bring online. I believe next year, 2022, 2023. But it's encouraging that Shell has now bought into some of the legacy assets that Anadarko had, and it starts to suggest that they think that there's new plays there that may be more liquid driven. But that doesn't hit the watch of Duque, and whereas unconventional certainly could. At least from a periphery standpoint. So I wrote a policy paper for the Atlantic Council in October, leading up to the first bid round that was launched, that ended up awarding one project to Ecopetrol, Cale. And now we're going to have at least a second bid round. But there's some unanswered questions, I think, particularly for the private sector. So I think the expectation is that Ecopetrol is all in. I mean, they made the investment into the Permian alongside of Oxy, and they want this to work. And so that's a very different kind of scenario than what you have for the private sector. So for the private sector, there's two main issues. One is the judicial overhang that still is out there. So the CDE has not made a final ruling. permitting all of this to 100% go forward. And then it's the go forward path. So if in fact you're going to invest, somewhere, Ecopetrol has now said it's going to invest roughly $75 million on Calva. What do you get at the end of it? Assuming that it's successful, assuming that environmentally you've been able to do this to the satisfaction of authorities as well as communities, and from a social perspective, what's the path forward? And the government hasn't really been able to articulate that path. So that really leads back to what Sergio said, which is that I think we will see there's going to be some M&A opportunities. I think there could be some more sizable assets, because sizable assets is really the only path forward. There's been a lot of the ANH bid rounds were really a relief valve for some of the Canadian companies that needed to show some type of growth. They also went to Ecuador because they just weren't getting enough kind of activity. If Colombia wants to keep that activity here, it needs to put something much more material on the table. And that's going to be really the thing to look for. So as the tax reform, and we didn't really kind of get into it, but it's really about eliminating these subsidies on VAT. VAT, on a personal level is 19%. You're already at incredibly high levels. But that may have some impact, but it's not going to be the silver bullet. And so you're going to have to create. They're going to be very vulnerable. And the point is that's going to, as always, when you have volatility, it's going to create opportunities. So that's just the energy space. But I agree 100% with Sergio that we're going to see just a whole slew of different opportunity sets that kind of emerge because they have to. So I think that's probably the best way to leave it.
Excellent, excellent. John, thank you very much for the comments. And Sergio, thank you very much for joining us this morning. And you are going to be here for the conversation. And with that, I would like to pass to Brazil. We are going to cover Brazil, and we are having here with us Damaris Zampini, that is going to be our moderator this morning, and our guest speaker as well, Thiago de Aragao, that you're based in Washington, D.C. And I mentioned before, you are with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, based in, you have also in Brazil and different places. And thank you very much. And Damaris, the space is yours, okay?
Good afternoon. Well, good afternoon for me. Good morning for, I think, everybody else, and welcome. Thank you very much for joining. Very nice to meet you, Thiago de Aragao. Eu falo português, mas bocadinho diferente que o brasileiro. But welcome. Very excited to learn a little bit more about Brazil and some of the opportunities that are in that country. I've got a couple of questions set out, but I expect that the floor will be mostly yours to give us some updates. And as we go, I will ask some questions. And please, I welcome everybody that's attending today to ask any questions on the chat, and we will try to address all of them before our time is up. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. Well, talking about Brazil today is something that we have several roads in which we can pick before talking about Brazil. It's a country with a lot of opportunities, it's a country with a lot of mistakes, with a lot of recurrent mistakes, new ones, with an administration that might not transmit a lot of credibility or trust for some people. However, the country is still and will be, for the foreseeable future, always a country of great opportunities. The first point is that Brazil is a country that has an immense market, and Brazilians have a different view, and in general, this is very negative, but it can be applied as an opportunity. The fact that Brazilians, they consider citizenship, actually, they consider being part of the country. They consider being citizens through the act of being able to be economically included in society. Democracy in Brazil is very different than democracy in several other countries. While in the United States, the narrative of democracy has always revolved, and the same in Canada and in other countries, around values. In Brazil and in many Latin American countries, democracy is always associated to process, to procedures, to bureaucratic procedures of electing someone. The trust in democratic institutions varies a lot in Latin America, and in Brazil the same. But what makes a Brazilian and feel integrated to the entire country is his economic ability to be involved in the capability to buy and to be a part of the machinery of the economic growth of the country. Why is this important? For a country that since 1991, 1992, and mostly over the end of the 90s, over 90% of the homes in Brazil always had access to television. And the television in Brazil always with an amazing capability of showing commercials about products and everything else, educated the grand majority of Brazilians of how to consume. And even those that were not able to consume because of their economic strains, they knew how to consume and they knew what they would consume if they were given the opportunity to be part of this economic machinery. This created a country that the enormous majority of Brazilians, they are avid consumers of everything that they can put their hands to. At the same time, we're a country with not a lot of experience or tradition of saving money. Most Brazilians spend all their salaries month by month. Most of those expenditures focused on the necessities of life, but also on superfluous items, given the fact that the consumption is a part of their understanding of being integrated to something. This makes Brazil a fabulous market for anyone who wants to enter the market and explore this wide array of consumers which are ready to consume. And given the fact that although the economic environment and the economic development in Brazil is behind what we always expected, it always keeps growing in a steady way, although in a frustrating way, always under what we always expected for Brazil to go. The country is relatively independent in its private sector, always with the difficulties and problems that comes from the government. But the rules in Brazil, although complicated, they tend not to change. So although we can see a very heavy tax burden, a very heavy bureaucratic and red tape difficulties in the country for you to open a business, to export, to import, etc., the rules tend to be steady. So when you start understanding how you can work in Brazil to export, to import, to develop a market, once you learn that, it's something that you go forward. The exit of Ford from Brazil is a point out of the curve. Though Brazil is still a country that, São Paulo, for example, is the largest Swedish industrial city in the world, is the largest Japanese industrial city outside of Japan, is the largest German industrial city outside of Germany. So the country still consolidates for many, many decades several of the largest companies in the world that understand that the market. And once they begin understanding the difficulties of operating in Brazil, it's still very worth it. So the most important thing for anyone looking to invest in Brazil is dividing what the government can touch and what the government does not touch. This is why, for example, the integration between the United States and Brazil is extremely solid in the private sector, but not very solid in the governmental sector. And in the private sector, what makes this integration very solid? First, the history of American companies investing in Brazil, and to a smaller extent, but not less solid, the Canadian companies investing in Brazil and European companies investing in Brazil. The sophistication of the Brazilian banking system, which is considerably more developed than most countries in Latin America, and the fact that you have, as I said before, the consumers avid to explore these possibilities. One point that is very important is that when people look at Brazil, you have to make a very clear distinction of political instability from institutional instability. They're very two different aspects that must be observed continuously. In a very, very simple example, the institutional stability is how solid the walls of our house are, how solid the hydraulic system of a house is, how solid the electric system of the house is. The political stability is how harmonious the family living inside that house lives. So if you have a very complicated family in a solid house, we have a political problem. If we have a harmonious family in a very, very problematic house, then we have an institutional problem. Sometimes we tend to have two. In Brazil, what we have right now, we still have solid institutions in which the three powers, they are independent, the Congress, the judiciary, the executive. We have regulatory agencies that are still independent. We have a judiciary system that, although complicated, and because of the origin of the French law system of law, it's very interpretative, the role of the judge, rather than the Anglo-Saxonic way of simply applying what the rule clearly states. This also creates a point of confusion for several investors in Brazil. But the political environment in Brazil is messy, is chaotic. Is not necessarily 100% corrupt as the image of Brazil sometimes is exposed in the world. It's a political system that it's much more diffused, it's diluted with some important and dangerous points of corruption. But the biggest problem is the lack of planning and the lack of consolidating a short, middle, and long-term planning. So Brazil is a country of political instability, but not of institutional stability. The Congress is solid, is independent, and produces. The quality of the Congress may be questioned all the time because of the quality of the congressman, which reflects the education of the voters, which in its grand majority tends to be low and tend to be very typical in the Latin American sense of creating some very marginal and thin and weak connections between themselves and a politician before deciding how to vote for that individual. So Brazil is a country that investing in certain areas can always be very interesting, particularly logistics is an area in which there's a lot to grow. We have a lot of production in several areas, mining, general commodities, grains, etc., that depends on a better system of logistics. And the government, because they understand that, and at the same time, they want to invest less and less in the governmental standpoint on logistics and leave this role to the private sector, opens a very big opportunity. Second, in this sense, we have to look at Brazil not as a country as a whole when we're targeting investments. We have to look at Brazil in the capabilities of each state, because as a federative republic, we have a country that each state has different skills and capabilities and levels of professionalism to perform certain jobs and certain duties to attract investment. So São Paulo, Paraná, Santa Catarina, and some other states, if they were countries by itself, they would be first world countries in every sense of the word. When we look at Piauí, at Maranhão, they are very poor states that would be much more closer to certain states in Africa in terms of social and economic development than in Latin America. When we look at Rio de Janeiro, for example, it offers some levels of opportunity, particularly in the touristic sector, in the natural gas, but is a complicated state because of the history of corruption and also of violence. So the image of Rio de Janeiro cannot contaminate the entire view of Brazil. The image of certain poorer states cannot contaminate the entire analysis of what Brazil means. Just like the image of success of some states like São Paulo and Paraná cannot also be perceived as the general view towards Brazil, because there are different Brazils within Brazil. I'll also open up for some questions. Amars, I heard in the beginning that you already prepared some questions for me, so let's start with that.
Oh, so many questions. That was a really great overview. Thank you so much. I've been to Brazil myself several times, and the point that you make around, thinking of Brazil as one personality, I guess, is really impossible, because each part represents such a different, almost industry in some way. You look at the Amazonas, you look at, the South is very different from the North, and then of course, the different industries and personalities and how they work is all very distinct. So thank you for making that. I think it's very important for Canadians to really get that, sort of around the head, because one thing is traveling to Rio de Janeiro, it's gorgeous, it's beautiful, and plenty of opportunities. And I think that's, from some of the folks that I know that have conducted business in Brazil, it's usually the Rio de Janeiros that they go to. It's just because most of the time, in our part of the world, in Alberta, it's been a lot of trade around the energy sector. So with that in mind, I wanted to touch a little bit about overall energy, and then also opportunities as it relates to making our trade relationship with Canada, but more specifically in this context with Alberta. Again, we've done a lot on the energy side, but there's plenty of other industries, of course, agriculture being a big one for Brazil, as well as the services sector. And now with the whole big push of GHG reduction, and I understand that Brazil as a whole has a mandate to reduce GHGs by 43% by 2030. So that's in the next 9 years. So there's a couple of questions there. So I wonder if you can maybe touch around the energy sector, the GHGs, opportunities maybe for an energy mix, which is a big mandate of Brazil, and how maybe Canada can play a part in collaboration and taking a look at, the environment as a whole, and while addressing the ever-growing energy demand globally.
Okay, first of all, there are two different approaches towards the energy sector in Brazil. There is the governmental approach, and there is the private sector approach. Within the governmental approach, we can even divide into two subcategories: the approach towards the federal government and the institutions that belong, that are under control of the federal government, such as Petrobras, such as other organizations. And the second subcategory are the states, in which the negotiation, the conversations, the alliances can be developed from Alberta towards a specific state, such as São Paulo, Paraná, Espírito Santo, whatever. So ideally, given the capability of Alberta as a state on its own to present a very convincing and a very seductive portfolio of operations, this can always enhance and accelerate the procedures of developing approximations, conversations, alliances, opportunities, if there is a direct link with the states, not necessarily with the federal government. The federal government tends to institutionalize it in a way that ends up involving players which are not interesting for Alberta, for example, when they're observing in Brazil. There are modalities of partnerships for technical cooperation, for scientific cooperation, and for fast-track investments in energy that can be designed between Alberta and a specific state without going through all the red tape and bureaucracy from the federal government. When we look at that, we can look at the logistics of distribution of energy in Brazil. which you can have the logistics of distribution of electric energy, at the same time gas ducts and other capabilities. This is highly in demand constantly, and what we have right now are the Chinese companies making several investments in this sense. The Chinese, they understood, perhaps intuitively, the points that I'm bringing up right now, in which, since they understand that the relationship with the federal government is contaminated by politics in this triangle that exists until tomorrow between the United States, Brazil, and China, they have submerged and focused on partnerships on the private sector and on the state level sector. This is how they were able to accomplish offering the vaccine to the state of São Paulo to be distributed in there, and now it's becoming the #1 vaccine available in the country right now. So their approach was divided between the state to make it viable. So when they approached the state of São Paulo and the state of Paraná and Mato Grosso and Goiás for energy projects, their approach was targeted at the viability, at the necessary licenses, the necessary environmental licenses in order to expand the logistics, and the necessary tax exemptions that the states can offer in order to create a particular set of operations in a particular place. The second part of their approach was between company to company, was a B2B approach, in which they identified the players that were already involved in the logistics of production and distribution of energy. And the negotiation between the interested Chinese company, for example, directly with companies that are already part of this dynamics of logistics, made this negotiation much simpler, much faster, without the necessity to reach it to the government level. So this sort of approach makes it much more efficient, and you fly under the radar of the bureaucratic requests and entanglements that can come from the government. Once they have spread their capabilities and their investments and their operations within the logistics of energy through several states, through the B2B approach, they had reached a volume big enough that their negotiations with the government were not necessarily to make the operations viable, but to make the operations more efficient, because their operations were already settled in the country. The government could not make any political move to decrease their capabilities of operating or expanding their logistic operations in the country. So then, once they have consolidated that, they reach the government simply to seek better efficiency of what they already had. Naturally, when you look at the energy environment in Brazil, you have some geographical conditions. For example, the state of Ceará and the state of Pernambuco, they are eager to develop from a state perspective and with local business partners a boost in their solar energy industry, as well as in their eolic parks and the industries for that. This can happen and can progress in a very fast speed without the necessity of having to go through Brasilia, through São Paulo, through Rio de Janeiro in order to accomplish that. So these are several opportunities that can be made in this sense. At the same time, when you look at the southern part of Brazil, the electric transmission lines that have historically been developed for the exchange of electric energy with Argentina and with Uruguay, they require a constant enhancement of these capabilities. And this is something today that lies completely in the hand of the private sector. And given the urbanization and the level of development of this particular region, not politically, because we know how Argentina and Brazil are complicated, but in terms of the consolidation of consumption, given the profile of the industries located within this particular area of the map, this is a great opportunity for companies to explore enhancing the transmission lines in this particular end. At the same time, you have the necessity for expansion of gas ducts in other parts of the country. We have an excess production of gas coming from Rio de Janeiro, in which the grand majority of this gas is simply burned because of the lack of capability to distribute this into other areas and to make it viable for consumption. So everything that is linked into logistics and making the particular energy reaching a group of consumers is something that will be welcomed by local businesses and companies that are already involved, by the state governments, and ultimately by the federal government as well.
Excellent. I'm looking to see if we've got any questions from the audience. And Miguel, just a time check. Where are we at? Have we got a couple of more minutes? Did we lose Miguel? Because I can ask a lot more questions.
We have 10 minutes. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Sounds good. Okay. So another question that I wanted to ask about was around, so you talk about the regionalization and going to state rather than waiting for the big federal government to sort of give you the seal of approval before market entry. So how can companies, position themselves at the provincial level when, it's their first time, for example? I know that there's some really great folks within our Alberta government, as well as our federal government in the trade side of things that really try to help. But of course, the more companies out there that may or may not know what channels to use once they are in Brazil. And then I wanted to also segue between, the energy mix. It sounds like, in summary, you're looking for infrastructure and distribution and supply chain of energy, because the resources are there. It's a matter of maybe bringing in the technology, the know-how, the different processes, and then the different ways of actually creating that access for resources for the country to be able to utilize their own resources, because again, Brazil is very resources rich. So a couple of questions in there. Number one, in order to reach this sort of perfect level or greater level of access to your own resources, including energy and otherwise, what are the key direct channels that people can utilize in order to do that? And where does technology play in all of this? So, again, Alberta has different technology innovation channels. For example, Alberta is one of the most innovative provinces in Canada. We create a lot of technology, both digital and non-digital, and of course in the energy sector as well as agriculture. So again, the point is, how do we as Canadian companies and Alberta companies, how can we position our products and services at the local level? What are the channels we can use? And what are the opportunities that you may see that are maybe the lowest hanging fruit where everybody can benefit from?
I've seen firsthand in Alberta all these amazing capabilities that you guys have. I spoke at the BAMF conference a few years ago, so it's very impressive. There are several routes. I'm going to describe slightly the routes that I do with the companies that I advise when doing this type of work. Okay, usually what I do is, depending on the state and depending on the segment that you're looking for, you have in Brazil a set of decision makers and opinion makers. The organogram in Brazil is something that fools a lot of individuals because the power is not as obvious as an organogram in a website shows. So ideally what I do is, and any company should have this in mind, is develop, for example, an initial stakeholders map of around 100 individuals that involve the decision makers, the opinion makers, and the individuals that can pose to you the bigger set of difficulties for you to advance with certain project or a certain technology. This not only involved the public sector and the government officials, but also has to involve competitors, complementary companies to your operations, opportunities, and all those kind of information that you can have available, and at the same time the connections between them, so you can have a very clear view if the majority of the map is a majority that welcomes what you're trying to bring, or if the majority of the map is something that is not yet prepared for what you're trying to bring, depending on the state, depending on your targets. You have two options that you can go from there. You can either establish a company in Brazil and start operating from there through the natural procedures of gaining the licenses, which can be tiring, but the rules are there. Although complex, boring, redundant, sometimes useless, the rules there are there, and by following them, you can start a process of gaining the necessary licenses. The acceleration procedure usually happens when the company is willing to develop a joint venture with some a local company that already have the reputation and the capability to be complementary to that particular technology or that particular business that you're offering. And the due diligence to evaluate a potential joint venture is something that it has to be done very thoroughly, not only for the reputation of the behavior of the ethical capabilities of the company, but also to the extent of their technical capabilities in order to be able to provide you with what you need, including sometimes when a joint venture is made, this can facilitate a lot the process of obtaining the licenses, particularly environmental licenses that tend to be the slowest ones to obtain, because a joint venture can already give you the opportunity to incorporate your product into something that is already consolidated and already have the necessary licenses for that. The major difficulties that has to be observed is the import tax, how the IRS will evaluate the entrance of a particular new technology that you're bringing to the company, to the country, and up to which extent you can add some parts produced in Brazil in order to dilute the cost of bringing a particular technology or a particular piece of equipment.
Right, or jobs, right?
Exactly.
Yep.
And depending on the state, you will have a higher level of education of jobs in which you will be able to bring in. This varies a lot from state to state. And this is probably what will bring the second set of difficulties, which is handling and understanding the labor laws in Brazil, which are also complex. They are extremely beneficial to the worker. And this is a cost that has to be incorporated to your analysis of putting yourself in the country for the long run. Although it can sound scary for many, we have the largest companies in the world in Brazil for 100 years, 90 years, 80 years. A poll made a decade ago with Brazilians about Volkswagen. The grand majority of Brazilians thought that Volkswagen was a Brazilian company because of how established they were in the country.
Yeah,
So
that's great.
this construction is a construction that has to be made basis by basis, and it has several alternatives that can be taken into consideration.
Excellent. Okay, we've got a couple of questions actually. I was looking at the wrong chat box, so I missed a couple of questions here. I've got one from Jose Villegas, and it says, what about nationalization cost in Brazil?
Of placing a company to work in the entire Brazilian, well, the nationalization cost in Brazil, it depends a lot. Again, the largest cost that a company will have in Brazil out of the ordinary when they are observing how they're going to place there is the labor cost. So if you are a company that will require a large labor force, this is something that you must incorporate in your cost because of the lawsuits that necessarily will happen. The lawsuits are small, they do not affect the reputation, the operation of the company, but it's something that you will have to have a very interesting and competent legal area in order to deal with all of that. Because the costs, they are high. When you fire someone, you pay a considerable amount related to what they were earning before. They can always complain to the labor court that
it's a long process. That may almost be, it probably costs more to get rid of somebody than to hire somebody.
Exactly, much more. So this is the cost. The second cost is the volatility of the economic environment in Brazil. You have an environment that demonstrates confidence in growth, and then quickly, because of a mistake made by the government or a promise that wasn't fulfilled in relation to reforms, in relation to privatizations, etc., might increase the cost. If the company is coming to Brazil depending on something that will happen, or depending on something that they believe the government will move forward and approve in the next months or years, this is a problem because the time frame will always betray you. So if a company is looking at the privatization of Eletrobras, for example, which will happen, we just don't know when. Although the government promises the privatization of Eletrobras for the next 3 months since the beginning of the administration. So if the consolidation of your business in Brazil has a goal of taking advantage of the breakaway of the company, of Eletrobras, into several regions, and to be a partner of a privatized area of what was Eletrobras, perhaps it's better waiting a little bit more or monitoring a little bit closer how this will go. Because if you simply believe the news, you might shoot too soon, and will impose different costs for you.
Sure, that's awesome. Miguel, I see you're back. Are we over time? Do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, let's say the question that we have in there, but yeah, we need to be quick, but yeah.
Okay, so we've got a couple of questions. One of them actually talked about the 2 states that you mentioned that are eager to develop. The other question was, is natural gas production a byproduct? If there is too much that is combusted to get rid of it, is there a natural gas market? Possibly this is highly regional issues as well. And then the last question that we have, so I'll let you pick, is from Benigno. It says, what has it been the divestment strategy of Petrobras for so far in the onshore oil and gas sector? What has been the impact of divestment strategy of Petrobras so far in the onshore oil and gas sector? Your choice.
So to be very fast here, the two states that I mentioned for solar energy and eolic are the states of Ceará, C-E-A-R-A, and the other state is Pernambuco.
Pernambuco, I got it.
Exactly. And
sent.
Yes, in relation to natural gas, there is a lot that is produced, and there are very little. The costs of commercialization of this are still high for some companies. So for them, it's better to burn, because since the costs of distribution is high because of the lack of proper logistical alternatives for this, it ends up accumulating the costs and making them choose to burn the product more than simply using everything that they have as capability. At the end of the day, is a problem more of the capability of distribution, in which these companies that are burning gas, they would love to have partners to be able to develop that, because themselves, it's not the central core of their operations in Brazil. The central core is the exploration of oil. So this is something that for them, without proper partners and without proper logistics to distribute that, it's better just to not use it and to burn part of it instead of using 100%. The divestment strategy of Petrobras is mainly focused at the fringe companies that were more focused at the distribution, because of this logic of the privatization of the distribution and opening the distribution to private companies to do that. So the capabilities of exploring oil and gas are still the core areas of the company, but with a more willingness to have partners to do that, and not to be the sole operator in areas that they cannot do it anymore, until we had years before. Brazil learned a lesson that Mexico didn't learn in relation to Pemex, in which they believe that power comes in locking the door, while Petrobras understood that power comes by allowing powerful individuals to get inside your house as well. So this is the biggest difference, and the investment in Petrobras is simply to make the company lighter, more efficient, rather than a result of economic difficulties of the company.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This was wonderful, super enlightening. I've learned a lot, and I look forward to staying in touch. I also thank you for the comment about Alberta's innovation. And as an Albertan, I'm very proud to say that, yes, we are ready to collaborate with all Latin American countries and really the world. So thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you
Ciao.
very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Thiago and Damaris. Thank you, and very, very interesting conversation about Brazil. And with that, now we are going to proceed to the Guyana outlook. I think we are very excited to learn more about Guyana. This is a very, very, very relevant market that is taking more consideration around the oil and gas industry and other opportunities. And I would like to invite to all the panel, Anand Harilal, with Trade Commissioner, Global Affairs Canada, and Natalia Sipersau, she's the Chief Executive Officer of the new Canada Guyana Chamber of Commerce. Welcome. And Ha Guyen, that is the Executive Director for Global Oil with IHS Markets. And thank you very much to all of you. And I'm going to ask, in this case, Anand, you are going to help us to moderate the conversation, and we're going to have an overview by Anand in the what is happening in Guyana, and after we are going to have Ha and Natalia just to share some perspectives. And welcome everybody. Go ahead, Anand.
Hi, Miguel. Good afternoon and good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to be part of this, of the economic outlook discussions for the Americas. And pleased to be talking to you about the market in Guyana. So I'll be moderating the session, and as well as Hadwen, who I'll pass it over in a few minutes. But I just wanted to sort of set the stage for our discussion today. The market right now with lots of opportunities. It's really a hot spot with lots of investment potential. It was a market that was previously unknown until we had the first oil find in 2015. Since then, the landscape has changed significantly. Last year, the IMF had projected the growth for Guyana to be 26.2%, which was revised down from about 86%, which was largely due to setbacks from COVID-19, as well as some political uncertainties in the market. Important to know that growth for the previous 3 years, 2017 to 2019, averaged about 3.6%. So to have, even to have the growth rate reduced from 86% to 26.2%, that's pretty significant. It was unprecedented in 2020. A year where a lot of markets weren't doing well, especially in Latin America and globally as well too. So this was largely due to the oil production, which started in December 2019 and was amplified in 2020. The non-oil sectors declined about 4.9% of GDP, but we do expect those sectors to bounce back in 2020. It wasn't just the oil sector that was keeping the economy afloat. Mining, especially gold, is being a major foreign exchange earner, and it contributes to about 10% of GDP. So in 2020, for the first half of the year, mining grew about to some of the opportunities in the market. Moving forward, IDB projects the growth rate to be about 14.9% for the next 5 years. And again, this is largely due to the oil and gas production, well, oil rather, and investments in other areas. For example, there is $1 billion projected to enter the market in the area of real estate, and in the form of hotels. There are probably about 10 major hotels that are planning to get set up in the market, ranging from the Marriott to Best Western and Hilton and some of the other chains. So, really an exciting time in the market that's now politically stable. The government is working assiduously in terms of improving the investment framework, and that's both the legal infrastructure as well as the administrative infrastructure measures such as currently being looked at. So really a good time to look at the market. And I'll pause here and I'll hand it over to my two other colleagues, Guyana and Natalia, who will be talking a little bit more about the market. I think Ha is going to be talking a little bit more about the energy side of things and the market prospects with respect to the oil and gas sector, and Natalia will cover off the market opportunities as well as operating in the market. So I'll hand it over to Ha, and I look forward to participants sending questions so we can have a really good dynamic discussion this afternoon.
You are on mute, Ha. You need to open your mic. It's come and goes, so we can start with Natalia with an overview of Natalia, are you ready just to share about the infrastructure, different opportunities, and probably at the end Ha can join us for the oil and gas sector.
Hi.
Go ahead, Natalia.
All right. Well, as Anand touched on, the PPP party, after a protracted electoral process, took office in August of 2020. And they're going to be presenting their 2021 budget on February 5th. They've said that the budget will outline government's medium and long-term plans for Guyana and will include a number of important initiatives that are crucial to the government's transformative plans for Guyana. There's a lot of concern within Guyana that in terms of the electorate and the people at large, that the country not put all its eggs in the same basket and repeat the mistakes of neighboring Trinidad and Venezuela. So there are plans to revive and bolster traditional economic sectors in order to create a more diversified and resilient economy. So Guyana's rapid growth through the oil and gas discoveries and the monies that will be coming in is expected to create a significant investment opportunities outside of oil and gas in areas such as infrastructural development, renewable energy, agriculture, forestry, manufacturing, ICT services, as well as tourism. So to this end, there's a number of infrastructural projects that are planned to facilitate this economic expansion and creation of new markets. So it includes rehabilitating existing roads, building new roads and highways, and the government's plan is to open up new areas for development. It's looking at the construction of a road link to Brazil that will open up Guyana to landlocked parts of Brazil, expand market opportunities, and of course, this would give Guyana unprecedented access to one of the largest economies in the world. Additionally, there's a new bridge plan for completion within 4 years that's supposed to be constructed across the Demerara River. There's plans for a deep water harbor, the dredging of the Demerara Harbor, and a bridge link to Suriname. All of these are part of the plan to enhance cross-sectorial growth of the Guyanese economy. Guyana is currently wholly dependent on fossil fuels for electricity generation by the state-owned Guyana Power and Light Company. The cost of electricity is fairly high, and most businesses say that the lack of affordable and reliable power is one of the main barriers to their competitive international trade. The power supply is unreliable, it's expensive, and many large businesses self-generate in order to get cost savings and efficiency. The government has indicated that it's seeking investors to develop a mix of energy projects in order to generate an additional 400 megawatts of installed capacity. And it will seek to have the natural gas produced at the Liza discovery piped to shore to be used for power generation by 2023. They recently indicated that they were looking at the former sugar estate Wales on the west bank of Demerara as a desirable location. Of course, this project still has to go through geotechnical, geophysical, and environmental studies before it goes to public tender. Through the energy development, they're also looking at pursuing hinterland electrification through the provision of mini grids for hinterland communities. The Amila Falls hydroelectric project, which was shelved under the previous government, will recommence, and Guyana is seeking investors for these energy projects. I think that given Canada's experience and capabilities with natural gas and hydro, these are areas that are really ripe for Canadian expertise and investment. Guyana is looking at modernizing its agriculture sectors. It's encouraging development of the intermediate savannas for large-scale farming. There's several Brazilian companies that have expressed interest in this regard and have applied to the government for long-term leases of state lands for the cultivation of corn and soybean, which is expected to be taken through the value-added phases of development to be translated into livestock, animal feed, and bioethanol. There's also opportunities for investors to expand the traditional agriculture production of rice, sugar, and livestock, as well as non-traditional sectors such as coconut, aquaculture, horticulture, and poultry. Recently, President Irfan Ali expressed the government's desire to develop the aquaculture industry to be globally competitive. With respect to tourism, as Anand mentioned, the government has signed some 30 MOUs with several investors in hope of realizing at least 4 new branded hotels in Guyana over the next 5 years. Mainly, this is to address the business travel market. In 2019, Guyana won several tourism awards for ecotourism, adventure tourism, and as a sustainable tourism destination. These are opportunities to build on these successes, especially by involving and partnering with indigenous communities. The government has indicated that they will rehabilitate the Lefem Aerodrome on the border with Brazil and develop it into an international airport as part of their drive to boost ecotourism and adventure tourism. In terms of the housing, there's a drive to construct some 5,000 homes annually, but a majority of these homes are going to be low-income housing. And I know that there's several businesses, foreign businesses in prefab construction that are looking to bring low-cost housing and prefab commercial and industrial buildings to the Guyanese market. With respect to mining, traditionally the mining sector was focused on gold, bauxite, and diamonds, but Guyana also has a lot of other deposits such as manganese, tungsten, iron, nickel. The government, at their last mini budget at the end of last year, removed VAT and duties on machinery and equipment to allow for the recapitalization of the mining sector. There are approximately, I think, 10 Canadian mining companies operating in Guyana. And these include some of our own members, Guyana Goldfields, Gold Source, and GoldX Mines. In the past, Guyana has relied heavily on donors such as the IADB and the World Bank for financing of their major infrastructural projects. However, with the introduction of oil and gas, Guyana is now facing reclassification, and many of the country's development and rapid transformation will require foreign investments, including through public-private partnerships. And the current President Ali has indicated a number of times that the government is really hoping to see some public-private partnerships to drive his transformational development plans. I think that this places Guyana in the perfect juncture it places Canada at the perfect juncture to invest in Guyana, because Canada has always been a longtime partner of Guyana. It's been like, over 100 years that Canadians have been involved in some sort of business activity or the other in Guyana. Also, one of the largest Guyanese diaspora populations is based in Canada. There's a trust that Guyanese extend to Canadians as a partner, which can't be underestimated, and Canadian investment can gain the advantage through strategic partnerships with Guyanese companies. At the Canadian Chamber, we're here to identify concrete linkages with Canadian businesses for cooperation and technical assistance to support Guyana's expansion and development. So right now, the Chamber is pursuing advantages for its members in the energy sector, including alternative energy, wind and solar power, infrastructure development, ICT, agriculture and housing, as well as looking to help source technical assistance from Canada to help build frameworks and for innovative public administration initiatives. For instance, the current government is looking at a single window platform to improve the ease of doing business. And we're currently looking at the Ontario government to see if they can provide any help or capacity in that area.
That's excellent, Natalia. Thank you for the review. And hi, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Hi, can you guys hear me now?
Yes, we do.
Okay, thank you. Apologies on the IT issues earlier. Thank you for the opportunity today for me to speak in regards to Guyana. So what I'll cover is what we've seen in the new producer and new exporter globally and how it fits into the picture. As you know, Guyana has, the key E&Ps from Exxon and Hess have moved forward on the billions and billions of reserves that they found, right? And what we've seen, the new crude that's coming out of it is called Liza. And the crude is actually looking at it in a market perspective, how it's competitive, right? We know the barrels are there, how big it's going to grow, and where's the competition, where is it going? So as you know, there's a lot of projects in queue. The second or third phases will move forward, and there are some future tiebacks to that. And Guyana, compared to other areas within the region, the break-even price is quite cheap. And the crude that's coming out is very similar to Dated Brent crude or WTI crude, which is a light sweet crude. And it's essentially going to the same markets as those crudes, right? And so we see that Guyana is probably going to grow 1 million barrels per day. This is just the oil side, so I'm covering the oil side. Gas is a whole different story. And where we've seen it go is actually United States, Europe, and mainland China. It's a sweeter grade than a lot of the Latin crudes, such as Venezuela. We'll be talking about that later, but the really heavy stuff, such as Venezuela, Mexico Maya, and some of the older traditional Colombia and Argentinian crudes, which are heavier, right? And so this is a new slate of crude that's quite competitive, and it's a 32 API and 0.5 sulfur. And how it's priced against dated Brent is about $2, negative $2 if you were to take the difference between two crudes. So it's quite economical, right, once it's in the market. And, you know, why is the Gulf Coast taking it, right? So that's a good question that I'm getting recently. And so Exxon is actually shipping it from Guyana to the Gulf Coast, and it's an ideal blend for blending some of heavier stuff or even the lighter stuff. So it's more economical to go through their configurations. As for Europe and China, so China, if you're familiar with Asia, a lot of the traditional grades of light crude is in decline. And then with the U.S.-China trade war, you know, less U.S. crude was coming in. And so it's actually competitive, apart from Brazilian crude, which we talked about in the last session, that fitted into the China slate, but also Guyana. And so we've seen for China about a handful of shipments since last year making their way to China mainland. And for Europe, it's a very similar story where dated Brent and some of the lighter crudes within Europe are declining, and there's a home for Guyana there. So those are the three key areas, and that's being exported. And so the competitive crudes for each region is the domestic crudes, WTI, and also some CIS crudes within that are coming from Russia and Kazakh. A few other things I like to highlight how it's different to other sweet crudes, right, is that when you're running it through a refinery, right, refiners get the crude, they blend it, they run it, and they want to get the most economical output with the best yields, right? So in the U.S., it's actually, if you compare it to other competitive crudes, it's actually extracting more gasoline. And then compared to African crudes, it's a little bit of more jet and Kuro for those medium sweet, light sweet grades for Africa. And then if you're comparing to Europe, CIS, there's actually less distillate. And then for Latin crudes, competitive, and Asia, there's less residual fuel oil. So putting that all together, it's benchmarked quite nicely competitively to other benchmark crudes. And I'll pass it over back to the other two colleagues.
Great, thank you. I've got a question for you, and I'll start us off. We have some other questions coming in from the participants as well too. You're quite aware, energy transition is really a highly contested topic at this time. You've got companies like BP investing in innovations in decarbonization and renewable energy partnership and API due to differences in climate change positions. And we've got American companies who are in the market that are not necessarily budging on this issue, despite pressures from investors Canada itself has made, some strides in terms of in terms of its climate change commitments, and Alberta in particular has invested heavily in initiatives like carbon sequestration. And in December, Canada launched its hydrogen strategy. So lots of these discussions are happening. Lots of initiatives are being taken. Canada is hoping to deliver up to 30% of its energy use from hydrogen by 2050. So very ambitious targets, lots of policies in place. Now, with all these discussions that's happening at this time, what does this mean for a market like Guyana that's now starting up, and how are these discussions likely to impact the longevity of the industry here?
Yeah, so if we just launched a top 5 issues for Latin America, and if you take a step back on how the energy transition has happened within the region, right? And I'd have to say Brazil was one of the leading countries in energy transition, right? They started out with biofuels. They were one of the key producers for biofuels with sugarcane, and then it's evolved with different kinds of biomass. And so within the region, right, we see that potentially, I'm talking about Latin in general, is things will start swaying, right? But if you look at historically how things have evolved, biofuels is normally the key attribute coming out of the region, and then there are other renewables, right? So to me, it's too early to say, right? There's a lot of policy that needs to move forward, and then alliances with other countries and stuff. So it's it won't obviously happen overnight, but a lot of E&Ps are starting to change their portfolio from oil to gas, but into more other energy sources, right? So fossil fuels will always be there as we look at all of the reserves in oil, right, as the default. But at the end of the day, hydrogen going in or any other biofuel, to me, it's key to policy, and then also, who's the leader in the country or the region on how fast that would move.
Okay, thank you. There's another question here, and it's from the audience. I understand all oil and gas production is offshore in Guyana. Is there onshore potential? Any plans?
As for now, what we're projecting is mostly offshore, right? And it's the infrastructure expanding from Payara and Liza and future reserves that they've just announced. So as of now, we don't have any onshore reserves that we're evaluating within the production. The only extension of the production is Suriname, right? So it's the same basin, but hasn't quite taken off as Guyana. So I would say that's the next thing to look at within the region.
And I'll just add to that. I do know that this is something that the government had made a pronouncement on, because other investors had asked this question. There were some finds in the onshore basin, which is in the south of Guyana and the border with Brazil. However, those fines, I understand, were not of commercial value, and so they weren't pursued. And so I think the last or the latest activity in that basin was in the 90s. However, I do understand maybe with new technologies that can be revisited, but at this time, the government, the petroleum administration and the framework and getting the petroleum legislation in place before they expand to that basin.
Yeah, so I would think of, you know, if you were to look at, let's say there's a potential onshore production in Guyana, you have to look at all the other areas around the world that have that, right? And so you have to think about the infrastructure, midstream infrastructure, which the U.S. has, right, for most of the unconventionals. And so once there's investors for that, right, there's plenty of pipelines within the U.S. now. It's actually over from production. And then from there, you have to look at, you know, is it more economical for me to go by pipeline or by freight, which is something that Canada looks at very closely when they're shipping their crude, right? And so adding that on, is it economical enough, apart from just having the production on shore, to transport it to a port, right? Because right now it's straight on an FPSO and then goes out to the market. So there's not as much transportation cost. So when you add that on, it's a few more dollars on top of it by barrel.
Thank you. Natalia, you mentioned earlier prospects in terms of the agriculture sector. And that's, you know, one of the areas in terms of one of the areas the government has identified for diversification, especially to avoid being a victim of the Dutch disease. Alberta has immense capabilities in the agriculture sector, and, you know, well-developed capabilities in terms of beef production, exporting about 2.5 billion in 2019. You know, how can we leverage these exportable capabilities from Alberta to help diversify the market in Guyana in the agriculture sector?
Well, first of all, we haven't seen that much Canadian interest when it comes to large-scale agriculture in Guyana. I don't know why the Canadians haven't jumped on it the way the Brazilians have, because there is the ability to do, you know, the way the Brazilians have it planned. It's planned communities, planned farming communities, with starting off with soy, etc., and then moving on into livestock. We have seen international companies coming in terms of looking at coconut production. We actually have a Canadian company that's in here right now that's doing a coconut value added factory up on the Linden Highway, and they're looking at water, copra, byproducts, etc. But in terms of Alberta, I honestly am not that familiar with the Alberta market. I'm just coming into it now, and so I can't really touch on that too much.
Well, we need to start to work together to move. We are doing a series of events of ¿Qué pasa in Latin America? And probably we can do something with Guyana, because I think there is a lot of potential. And with that, Anand, I want to, we are very, very short in time and we need to start the next panel, but I want to appreciate to the three of you, Anand, and Natalia, for sharing your knowledge and understanding more the Guyana market that I think is a market with a lot of potential for Canadian companies. And thank you very much. And with that, I want to transition to our next session that we are going to cover Mexico market. And I have with me here my colleague, my CCA director, Karen Posada, is going to be moderating this panel. And I welcome the participation of our good friend, Leonardo Beltran, He's a research fellow for the Institute of the Americas, and also John Padilla with the IPD Latin America. Karen, the floor is yours.
Hey, Miguel. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's my honor to be moderating this panel. As Miguel mentioned, it's a real honor to introduce the two panelists for this Mexico discussion, both of whom are widely recognized and respected for their deep knowledge of the Mexico economy. Leonardo Beltran is with the Institute of the Americas and Sustainable Energy for All, based in Mexico. And John Padilla, who you saw earlier on the Colombia panel, is with IPD Latin America, based in Bogotá. And because our time is very short, I won't go into their bios. You'll see them looping on the screen. I'll also refrain from interjecting during this conversation and instead field questions if there's a little bit of time at the end of the discussion. And with that, I will hand it over to John and Leonardo.
Thanks very much, Karen. Sorry.
No, Leonardo, por favor, please.
Okay. Thanks very much, Karen. I really appreciate the opportunity, the invitation, Miguel, Damaris, and the rest of the council. Karen, it's our second time sharing the floor, so it's a pleasure and delighted to do that. And with John, it seems like every other week we are in similar events, but I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with you, John and Karen. And perhaps let me, or maybe let me pass the floor to John, and then we can start our conversation. Sorry about that. John?
John, I think you're muted. Do we have John?
Probably will.
I think he may have frozen. Leonardo, perhaps you could provide some remarks and we'll see if we can get John back online again. Oh, I see him.
Okay.
Here he is. Nope.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Was it missed? I just completely broke off there. I wasn't hearing anything.
Okay, we can hear you now, John.
Okay. No, fantastic. No, a pleasure to share the stage with the two of you again. You know, obviously, and you know, appreciate the invitation. It's, you know, 2020 was a very revealing year, I think, in Mexico, and it was the second year of the administration. And I think throughout the first year of the administration, we had seen a lot of questions in terms of what 4T really meant. 2020, I think the veil was lifted, and it became very clear what that is. And that is basically centralization. It's back to the 1960s, old school pre. I think a lot of people confuse López Obrador for being a leftist. I would say that the focus on the poorer factions is really a conduit. He is a old school priista of major proportions. And that, I think, has played itself out very clear in 2020. So what that means in terms of centralism is Mexico is a country that has very much been on a path of decentralization over the last 30 years. It's been slow, but states have gained certain levels of power. And now you're seeing that kind of fight taking place between certain states. There's a federal alliance now that has been pushing back quite actively, and it's not just from one political party, but several. And essential to centralism are the monopolies. And so that's why the focus that we're seeing in terms of both Pemex and CFE. And everything is really being seen through the political lens. So I think people try to frequently use too much logic in terms of decisions and how they're really being made, but it's all 100% through a political lens. And this year is midterm elections, so June 6th, and the rhetoric that we're seeing is exactly what we expected. It's only amplifying, it's only increasing. It's being done with very deliberate intention. And it's all to basically kind of fire up the base that they have, and at the same time distract from some of the other, very serious realities that are taking place. So obviously you've got COVID, but and we've hit very extreme levels in Mexico, unfortunately. But politically, that hasn't had much of a downside impact for López Obrador. In many respects, I think it's really kind of given him cover for the project. And as he had said, it kind of fits like a glove. It's a ring on the finger, and it just protects him. So you have the numbers haven't moved is the point. There's a slightly larger population that thinks the healthcare situation is a complete disaster, but you have a very significant portion of the population that thinks that everything's fine. So it hasn't hurt him, but the other things have, and we have seen a very deliberate decline. Even if you take out the first 6 months of the administration, when his popularity was at incredibly high levels. So the economy, corruption, security issues are all having an impact. So I think that what I would say is that you have to appreciate that the things that are being done right now, the kind of picking of a fight with the U.S. as President Biden will be inaugurated tomorrow, is being done with a very deliberate effect to kowtow towards his base and really kind of engage and create this kind of anti-Americanism activity. Commerce is obviously a big issue, and USMCA is been at the forefront. We've seen lots of pushback from different associations. That's going to only continue to escalate. But I think that it's clear that, again, López Obrador wants to do this in a purely bilateral way, because that gives him it gives him the victim card to play. And I think the smarter route will be if not only US plus Canada really bind together, but also bring in their European counterparts. So we just saw the Spanish foreign minister pay a visit. It was very interesting to kind of watch the wording. It's the kind of wording that when the US says those kind of things gets itself in a lot of trouble, but Spain can obviously say those things for a lot of historical reasons. So, I think that obviously contract sanctity has come under a lot of scrutiny and concern. We can talk about some of the specific issues on the energy sector. What I would say are two major things. One is that the status quo is not going to be able to be sustained, neither internally nor with the external pressure that's coming down the road. Something's going to have to give. When you take a look at the Pemex finances, another area that we can, perhaps delve into a little bit more. It's costing the government a substantial amount more money, both in terms of injections as well as in terms of the royalties and tax revenue that it's receiving on the other end. And I think that the other issue that I would bring up is just in terms of the elections. There's been a lot of political analysts that have kind of said de facto Morena will sweep the elections. We don't see one scenario where that is even remotely a possibility. And the only way that Morena gets supermajority, particularly in Senate, and Senate doesn't have elections here in June, only the House does, is that you have such a sweeping victory that then you have defections. And when you take a look at both at the state level and at the federal level, there's much greater chances that they will lose space than they'll actually gain space. So I think the big question that I would put onto the table is that if Morena is at best able to only sustain its seats and likely will lose some, the question is how much, and election cycles are long, and 6 months is going to be a long period of time here. The courts, the Mexican courts continue to push back in the way that they have, and you have external pressures from the global community. The question is will López Obrador continue to kind of pursue the agenda that he's pursuing? So maybe that provokes a few little comments, and I'll leave it there.
So can I react, Karen?
Please do, Leonardo. This will be a very interesting reaction, I'm sure.
Great, thanks very much, Karen. Certainly, one of the elements that it's perhaps leading discussions here in Mexico is politics, because first, in order for the current administration to continue to move into his government plans, he needs to have the majority in the lower chamber. Otherwise, they will have to negotiate with other parties if they are to pass the public budget aligned with what the president wants. So that's the main challenge for the administration, to retain majority in the lower house, because that's the house that approves the house is the one that approves the budget. So that's the main concern for the administration. Of course, there are several other elements but probably those fall below second or third priorities for the president, because he's only focused on that part, politics. Now, there are, of course, other pressures or other levers to put some pressure into Mexico's situation. Certainly, the change in administration in the U.S., it's something that would work towards. Historically, Mexico have been and the U.S. have been collaborating both on security and economic terms. But with this administration, with the Biden administration, most probably an environmental taste would be more preeminent between in the relationship between Mexico and the US. And that environmental flavor has several areas of opportunity. One, of course, it's on the economy, because the administration of President-elect Biden has stated that they will go into a net zero route to meet the Paris Agreement. And that certainly would affect hydrocarbons, or the most polluting hydrocarbons. So there most probably would be a switch towards natural gas and less carbon content fuels. Probably continue to work on carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, but certainly coal would be phased out. And given that there would be a whole new focus on the transition to a low carbon economy or net zero, natural gas would be one of the winners in the US. And that for Mexico is fundamental because 60% plus of the power sector in Mexico relies on imported natural gas. So that's something that will have an effect into the economy, that it's positive for the relationship between US and Mexico. And certainly there's more interaction between the private and the public sector in Mexico and across borders. So probably that's another lever that would actually push the conversation, not only from politics, but also perhaps focusing a little bit more on economics. The other element, of course, is the clean energy sector. As we have heard, and John already mentioned, there have been different challenges with the policy maker, with the regulator, and with the operator in the power sector. And in the hydrocarbon sector is somewhat similar. However, there are larger investments in the hydrocarbon sector because one of the key or landmark projects of the president falls into the hydrocarbon sector, the Dos Bocas refinery. So the situation is somewhat uncertain because it seems that the regulator is it's in a situation where the legal framework mandates that there should be coordination between the policy and the regulation. That's what exactly says the legal framework. But that does not mean that the regulatory activity must be dominated by political decisions, but by technical and economic decisions. And that's stated in law. So there should be a balance between these two forces. And it seems that the politics is actually dominating. But as John was mentioning about the contract sanctity, what we can observe is that actually the rule of law is prevailing. So even though there are different signals and actions from the administration against existing projects, the judiciary and courts are actually enforcing the different elements that actually balance the equation from politics towards economics and technical aspects. So again, the other lever, I think, and we actually have to take a very good look at is what's the rule of law like in Mexico. And as of now, there has not been any breach in contracts. So there has been contract sanctity in place. Certainly, you have observed a larger number of cases going into courts, but the courts have declared isolated from politics as of now. Furthermore, in that particular regard, actually the court has stopped or halted the energy policy that has been put forward by the Ministry of Energy. So domestically, I think, even though politics would be dominating this year, the movement from the international stakeholders or the international partners, US, probably the European Union as well, because of the Paris Agreement, would have a larger effect this year into the economy. And probably I would also like to mention the in the domestic policy, it's not only these actions that we have observed, they have also reflected in their policy documents that they would like to see a stronger energy sector, and of course, in practical terms, you have not witnessed that because halting of processes, not granting permits or stopping the pace of granting these permits. But if you observe the documents put forward or published by the administration, the last available is for the power sector, for instance, is the PRODECEN with an outlook from 2019 all the way up to 2033. And they are envisioning an addition of 70 gigawatts of installed capacity. And out of those 70 gigawatts, it's 55% clean energy. So again, formally, in what you can analyze from the documents, it's one vision where the power sector will continue to grow, and most of the growth of the power sector would have to come from clean energy. So that's the good news. The bad news, of course, is that the economy is in recession. In terms of the business environment, is not very positive. The stop and the reaction of the regulators and the overall the institutional architecture of the energy sector. But in the end, probably it's much more noise of than the actual effect happening in the energy sector. Back to you.
So, I'll push back a little bit here, keep it a little engaged and lively. I think that what we've seen is, let me start with contract sanctity. And, the reality is that there was a brewery that essentially was canceled there in Mexicali through a quote unquote public consult, but it was really kind of a sham. We've had the airport that was canceled. We had basically threatened arbitration on natural gas pipelines. And most recently, we've seen the Etileno 21, which is a petrochemical facility that what the government ended up doing was exploiting a loophole and having Senegas cancel the natural gas transport contract, which should send a tremendous red flags because it's there to provide non-discriminatory access and independence. And so that clearly hasn't happened. The other thing I think which is interesting to take a look at is the recent blackout that took place. It was supposedly triggered in Tamaulipas. It affected over 10.5 million users by our estimation, over 20 states. And CFE was kind of caught red-handed, having fraudulently forged a document from local authorities. They've tried to use this as a reason why renewables are bad for the market. The reality is that there were 2 tenders for transmission lines that were to have been bid out at the onset of the administration that were canceled by this government. The Produsen that Leonardo is talking about back in 2017 had talked very, very extensively about just the poor condition of the infrastructure and the transmission lines and what needed to be done, and both investment in terms of maintenance and build out and redundancy. And the two factors that have absolutely come into play in this situation is low demand. And for people that know the electricity sector reasonably well, low demand actually can work just as bad as too much demand. That plus then the onset of renewables. And so you have increasing amount of renewables that are coming into the market, and they're not 24/7. And so you need a much more resilient system. But this is precisely why CFE has wanted to go back to a much more kind of old school system that is 24/7, because utilities around the world, they rarely want to kind of adapt. It's more work. Nobody wants to do it. It's been the case. We've seen it time and time again in many places. So yeah, I mean, I think, contract sanctity, investor certainty, these things have really been kind of put onto the plate. And you have two camps in Mexico today. So you have those that have a very significant footprint, and they're looking at this from a long-term perspective. And the prospectivity, like if you take a look at some of the exploration discoveries thus far, are really, really encouraging. And they're there for the long term. So, there's a lot of noise, as Leonardo talked about, and it's really very much about trying to CNH was an incredibly well-run regulator certainly by Latin American standards, and even on an international level basis. What's happened now is we're just going back to kind of, quite frankly, another Latin American regulator. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, but people are going to work through those processes to figure out how to move forward. For those that don't have a big footprint, or that are being directly affected now by things like the change in import permits. And so for people that are not aware, what the government just passed, they passed a regulation that does not permit new import or export permits of hydrocarbons for 20 years, as they had in the past. So there's only a handful of companies that have those. Most people were securing 1-year permits. Now they're going to move to a 5-year permit scheme. The reasons for it make a lot of sense, because it's a bit of a dirty little secret, but the fuel theft, the huachicol, continues to be very prevalent in the country. And when you have that many permits, you have no idea who's actually taking that product and how it's being sold to gas stations at a discount, and then remarketed. So if you are looking to kind of crack down on that, it's one of the justifications. It's a convenient excuse at the same time to essentially allow Pemex to secure more market control and power. And it's one of the few areas where Pemex is actually making money. So it's just margins. And that is part of the modus operandi with this administration in terms of strengthening Pemex and CFE. So for those folks, this is very much kind of a tipping point, and there's going to be a lot of companies that are going to have to figure out what they can do individually, whether trade associations and whether bilateral and free trade agreements are going to support their position, because this is it's a blatant pushback on the agreements that are in place, and it's just it's continued creeping expropriation, quite honestly. So what's happening right now is we have the termite effect, and it's just hollowing out from the inside. So the outside looks still fine. The regulator is still there, but on the substance on the inside, don't push because you might break through. So those are the two camps that are kind of really emerging. I think the opportunity set, to kind of turn and not be just completely negative is that whole model has run its course. And when you take a look at this from a financial perspective, an operational perspective, a technical perspective, it's absolutely impossible that this will continue. This is a game of mercy, and the only question is how quickly is the government willing to hit the button? So they've clearly been looking at exploiting all the options in terms of funding. For people that have followed it closely, they've looked at, Pemex, the board of directors has even, put out the idea of having the central bank invest its international reserves into the company. Obviously, that would be a nuclear option. It would not be viewed favorably by the markets, but it just shows the kind of level of desperation that exists. They already ran through the fideicomisos, the trusts. They've been toying around with Afores. It'll be the same type of situation there. So what we're seeing is we're seeing kind of the last vestiges of what the model can do, and it's compounded by the overall economic situation that is plaguing Mexico right now. That in turn, again, just like we talked about in Colombia, that volatility will create opportunities, but it's certainly not for the faint of heart. There's a lot of layers, as always, in Mexico.
Excellent. We are very short of time, Karen, but
one
we
quick
have
comment, Miguel. Can I make a quick comment, Miguel?
Yes, please. We have a question from Piero Larrier. Maybe we can close with that question, but go ahead, Leonardo. You have some comments, please.
Yeah, just one quick comment, not to end with a very negative outlook, just to say that I agree with that there's some challenges in a brewery, in pipelines, in the airport, and definitely that has affected the investor perception and sentiment. But perhaps let me also try to step back and see what happened. And basically they use the clauses of dispute settlements within those contracts. And what happened is that today they have canceled these projects, but the cost has been socialized and it has increased. So it's not about contract sanctity or the rule of law, but it's about a signal that you send to the politics that say that they are in charge. But the whole concept here is that actually Mexico continues to be a safe place for investments once they are reflected in a contract.
We do have a question here from the audience. Miguel, do we have time to address this one question?
Just 2 minutes more, but yes, please.
Okay, so this is about sovereign credit. Pemex is going to continue to drag down the federal government. Do you see the federal debt going to junk status?
I can try to jump in here. I mean, so right now you have, I'm less worried about sovereign downgrades. I mean, you have BBB minus from Fitch, S&P at BBB, and you've got Moody's at a increasingly difficult to defend Baa1 rating. I think there's more chance that you'll see further downgrades of Pemex before you see a downgrade of the sovereign. But that's not really where I think the biggest risk lies for Pemex right now. In fact, I think that the biggest risk is actually with its trade debt. It carries a pretty significant amount of that. And with the non-payment or delayed payment, very delayed payment to a lot of service providers, that I think represents the biggest risk from a financial perspective, because it has the potential to really create a domino effect. And at that stage, that's when you really, the wheels come off, very, very quickly, as we've seen in numerous cases in different scenarios, including things like Enron. So that's where I would be focusing my effort or focusing my attention. The sovereign, I just think it's not going to make a big move.
Thank you, John. I think that's all we have time for today. And I really appreciate your comments and insights, and way too little time to really dig deep into the situation in Mexico these days. And I would really like to invite you both back to a future event that CCA will undoubtedly host sometime this year. And we look forward to a much deeper, broader conversation. Thanks again.
Thank you, Karen. Thanks, Leonardo.
Thanks very much, Karen. Thank you, John.
Very much, Leonardo.
Gracias, Miguel.
John and Karen, of course. Thank you very much. And with that, we are running a little bit late, but we are going to start our conversation on Venezuela. And I would like to invite David Vaughts and also Eric Farnsworth. David is also partnered with John. They are with the IPD Latin America. And our good friend Eric Farnsworth with the Council of the Americas and the Americas Society in Washington, D.C. I know that you are very passionate about Venezuela, and we are going to start with this Venezuela panel. I think, David, you are going to help us to run this session.
Sure, Miguel. Thanks so much for the invitation. It's great to be part of the conversation today, and certainly a pleasure to be here with Eric. We thought we'd start things off with some of the fundamentals of the Venezuelan oil industry before we dig into some politics and some prospects for 2021. So, in a nutshell, Venezuela has the largest proved oil reserves in the world at 303 billion barrels, 85% of which are extra heavy high sulfur oil. The country's medium, light, and condensate reserves officially stand at about 41 billion barrels. Unfortunately, the government has failed to exploit these reserves efficiently over the years. US sanctions have further exacerbated the situation, and the country's economy has imploded right along with its oil output. GDP has been negative since 2014. In 2020, it contracted by 25%, following a 35% contraction the previous year. The IMF is predicting a further contraction of 25% this year. Venezuela is in its fourth year of hyperinflation. The fiscal system and public services have essentially collapsed. The economy has been dollarized most recently. Extreme poverty has increased from about 10% in 2013 to 80% in 2019, according to local consulting firm Ecoanalítica. Oil production has fallen from 1.4 million barrels a day in January 2019 to 499,000 barrels a day in December 2020. PDVSA produced 271,000 barrels of that total in December, edging out the country's joint ventures, which produced 228,000 barrels. Crude exports have fallen from 1.39 million barrels in January of 2019 to 390,000 barrels a day in December 2020. While power outages, underinvestment, and poor management were the main culprits applying that sort of downward pressure on production in early 2019, later in the year, US sanctions curtailed diluent imports, limiting heavy oil output. Additional sanctions targeted at traders and tanker owners in the second half of 2020 created storage bottlenecks that forced production shut-ins. This affected key off-takers like CNPC and Reliance, who were forced to stop lifting, and it also affected output essentially across the board. That said, PDVSA has been incredibly agile in its quest to find traders willing to brave US sanctions and was able to export an average of 503,000 barrels a day in 2020. That doesn't include 98,000 barrels a day of products as well. Venezuela's crude mix has gotten heavier, and therefore less profitable over time, with Murray 16 now the most important segregation. Diluted crude oil production has been curtailed due to the inability to import heavy naphtha. With the exception of PetroPR, upgraders went offline between November 2018 and May 2019, resulting in less or nil synthetic crude output. Venezuela's domestic refining system produced, or I should say processed, an average of 145,000 barrels a day in 2020. That's only 11% of nominal capacity. After a great deal of effort in 2020, PDVSA increased gasoline production from 10,000 barrels a day to 55,000 barrels a day at the end of the year. Remaining refining output is primarily dirty products with very high sulfur content. Talking about refining, well, domestic market supply is mainly linked to product availability. COVID-19 lockdown mitigated the impact of diesel and gasoline shortages in 2020. However, gasoline scarcity has still been one of the major factors for social unrest, resulting in at least 1,774 protests last year. In a typical year, consumption should be between 180 to 200,000 barrels a day. We're talking gasoline. In 2020, that average was just 45,000 barrels a day, and just 36,000 barrels a day in the second half of the year. This gives us a sense of how dire the gasoline situation is from a humanitarian perspective, and certainly in the event of a market recovery. It's an Achilles heel for the Maduro administration, but may also be a reason for the US to permit diesel and gasoline swaps in Q1 of this year, which is something that we're going to be watching very carefully. If the US were to relax sanctions for humanitarian reasons, we think that oil output could recover to 700,000+ barrels a day very quickly. Anything beyond that would require a regime change and a full lifting of sanctions. If that were to be the case, Venezuela could grow production by 2.1 million barrels a day over a 10-year period. That comes at a very, very high cost, which we estimate at about $139 billion over the 10 years, which may or may not be achievable. We think that the majority of incremental production, about 1.3 million barrels a day, would come from the country's joint ventures, highlighting the importance of maintaining the integrity of these assets to guarantee quick incremental output and the sustainability of whatever political regime comes next. There's at least 800,000 barrels a day of incremental output capacity in PDVSA's current fields, which would need to be auctioned off, and we think presents an opportunity when the time comes. While global energy transition may moderate extra heavy oil investment, we continue to see investor interest in the area. That said, Venezuela holds enough light to medium oil reserves in its mature fields to attract investors looking for cleaner reserves. There's still plenty of room for exploration and a high probability of high quality reserves in Lake Maracaibo's Cretaceous stratigraphy and below the El Furial field in eastern Venezuela. And again, with regard to energy transition, we see a fantastic opportunity to develop some of Venezuela's 200 TCF approved gas reserves, 31 TCF of which are non-associated. Both green and blue hydrogen are viable options, particularly given Venezuela's potential for carbon sequester, cheap hydroelectricity, and seemingly limitless water supply. Of course, it goes without saying that solar and wind are also good options for Venezuela on top of currently existing hydro. So finally, I would just like to say that the Venezuelan opposition has been working diligently to reform the country's hydrocarbons legislation and fiscal terms, understanding full well that political resolution will have to be immediately followed with very, very competitive investment terms and guarantees. I think our position on the potential for energy sector recovery in Venezuela, which hinges entirely on regime change and political resolution, is a common one. And Eric, I know you have some clear opinions on the viability or not of any political resolution this year, or at least in the short term. So why don't I turn it over to you now?
Well, David, thank you. It's tough to follow such a comprehensive report. I'll do my best, although I'm not an energy expert like you are by any stretch of the word. Miguel, it's great to have the opportunity to join you, and I look forward to giving some broader comments here in a few minutes about the Biden administration for the Western Hemisphere. But yeah, I mean, David, I think that the scenario that you laid out, you hit the appropriate note of potential optimism, but I think potential there is the key word. And I don't see a lot of potential in the near term that things will change significantly. I agree with your baseline that there won't be fundamental recovery. There can't be fundamental recovery in Venezuela with the current regime in place. I think that's just that's an assertion I would make, but I take it as a statement of fact. It doesn't mean there can't be some recovery. And I do think that the Biden administration coming in will be looking for ways, particularly to help alleviate some of the humanitarian disaster that Chavismo has caused, not just for Venezuela, but for the rest of the region as well. And we'll be looking for ways to do that. But I would hasten to say that some of the sanctions that currently exist on Venezuela, particularly the economic sanctions, the sectoral sanctions, already have humanitarian exceptions that are employed. So it's possible to put, healthcare and pharmaceuticals and medical equipment into the country. It's the Maduro regime that's actually preventing that from happening. So, the exceptions currently exist. I think the question is, would the Biden administration allow for greater production from Venezuela? And I think that the answer to that is certainly something I can't answer today, but I would speculate it would be a consideration to the extent that there could be a mechanism created that the income from such new operations would not go to increasing receipts to the regime, so that those receipts would be deployed for humanitarian relief, democracy development, and all the things that we know that the Maduro regime would reject out of hand. So it's a very complicated scenario. Meanwhile, I think you're quite right to suggest that it's not just the energy sector. That's the one that most people focus on for obvious reasons. But, this is the Latin America's largest humanitarian crisis in its modern history. Almost 20% of Venezuela's total population of 33 million are outside the country now as refugees. Most of those aren't in the United States, although some are, but most are in Colombia, Brazil, Latin America, many in Spain, Italy, etc. So you get a regional crisis that has been created because of ideology, completely unnecessary. Not caused by natural disaster, not a hurricane, not an earthquake, not some sort of natural disaster, but man-made for the ego and the political ideology and the self-interest, frankly, of those who control the regime. So this is it's a tragedy. It's a human tragedy. I think at the end of the day, it will have to be the Venezuelan people themselves who will find a path forward. I don't know how. What form that will take. I think the international community can and wants to be supportive in that regard. But the last thing I would say before turning it back to you to see if you agree with anything I just said or would like to add or subtract from it. But the idea that, the energy sector does have to be some sort of engine of economic recovery, there's no question about it. But I also think that the disrepair of the energy sector means that there have to be alternatives as well. I mean, it's not just the energy sector that Chavez and Maduro have destroyed, it's the entire economy of Venezuela, which at one point was quite vibrant. You remember Venezuela was the Latin America's wealthiest economy at one point in the not too distant past, but the entire private sector has been taken over and emasculated by the regime. But the agriculture sector, the manufacturing sector were quite vibrant at one point and need to be thought of in the context of recovery for the country as well. So I think that there's a lot that we could do, but you can't get to day one until you get to day zero. And that's the question, I think, for policymakers is how do you get a peaceful transition to return to the democratic path in Venezuela?
Well, that's the million-dollar question right there, Eric. One of the things I've been a little bit I don't know if the word is disgruntled with, but maybe I don't agree 110% with, is a lot of people are talking about the recent National Assembly election as sort of cementing Maduro in power. It's clear now that the PSUV, Maduro's party, has control over the National Assembly as of January 5th. However, we do see that the opposition has invoked this sort of administrative continuity clause, which I think is rather vague in the Constitution, but it's an argument that's been accepted by the US government. And the US government just issued OFAC General License 31A, which continues to recognize Juan Guaido as the interim president of the country, and the 2016 National Assembly is the, I guess, a viable National Assembly, and the representatives of Juan Guaido as the official interlocutors for Venezuela. The EU didn't go quite so far, but they still recognize Juan Guaido as a key interlocutor from the opposition. And the Lima Group, which I think is hopefully going to take on a more important role in 2021, with greater sort of interdependence with the United States government, has recognized the National Assembly and this special delegation as the legitimate representative of the country. All have recognized that the elections, the National Assembly elections, were not valid. So no one is recognizing the Maduro National Assembly. It just kind of confuses things a little bit. But what I see is that instead of cementing Maduro's power, we're really in sort of a status quo position right now. Maduro, before the elections, had his constituent assembly, which was really the body making all the laws domestically in Venezuela. And I think it's important to recognize that there are individuals and companies that are operating in Venezuela that have no other choice but to follow the laws of the Maduro administration and his new National Assembly. But internationally, when you're looking at issues pertaining to Venezuela's assets abroad, for example, I think that countries will take, particularly the US, obviously, guidance from OFAC. So I still see this as a status quo. And I don't know, I'm wondering what you think about what the opposition itself needs to do to kind of gain more momentum, because it's lost a heck of a lot of momentum over the last several months.
Well, it has. I mean, the point that you're raising, I think, is an important one. It's a question of, have things fundamentally changed since December 6th? I would argue that, in fact, that they have. Otherwise, if the Maduro administration, if the Maduro regime had not put so much value in control of the national legislature, it would not have gone to such great lengths to steal that election and to make sure that the elections were not even close to free and fair, to the point where the opposition, months before the election, announced a boycott, and there was a 70% abstention rate. Even the EU, which was desperate to find a way forward to try to work with the regime to get to free and fair elections, pulled out of election observation because they said there's just no way that this can be held in anything approaching democratic manner. And so the entire election process was illegitimate, and of course it returned over 90% of the seats, which had been expanded, by the way, to the regime. But my point is that if the regime didn't think it was important, they wouldn't have gone to that trouble, because it has caused a lot of heartburn in Caracas from the international community, who have condemned those actions. So it does seem that for whatever reason, the regime puts great store in having now captured the last remaining institution of Venezuela. And it does wrong foot the opposition, there's no question about it, the interim government, depending on who you're talking to, but it does wrong foot them, because it takes away their institutional base of support. Sure, they can meet and virtually and all that, but it really does change the dynamic on the ground. It's hard to compare countries or experiences. There are, occasions where governments in exile, essentially, or governments outside of the country, or governments that, don't have institutional bases, have come to take power through democratic process. There are instances, for example, where the international community continues to recognize governments long after they're not even in control of their territory. I think probably the best example would be Taiwan and mainland China, which the United States recognized until it didn't, but it was for years. And I'm not suggesting that China and Venezuela are in any way the same. I'm simply saying that this does complicate the issues. What it means on the legal front as well is now that the Maduro regime controls the national legislature, they can push through the laws, and particularly on the investment side. And as you say, that compels actors on the ground, whether Western or non-Western actors, to abide by those conditions. But it also gives them the ability to open up certain areas of the country for new investment and other things, which perhaps the previous legislature wasn't willing to do. So I think that there are some issues there. I think very quickly, I know our time is very limited, and but I just want to mention two other quick things. I think it's interesting that one of the things that doesn't get a lot of attention on Venezuela is the whole environmental crisis that's being visited on Venezuela by the Maduro regime. A lot of that's in the energy sector, David. I mean, the massive environmental devastation, because of lack of maintenance, because of lack of technology, because of lack of competent management, because of lack of funds to designate toward environmental cleanup, that sort of thing. That's one aspect, but there's a whole other aspect, and that is that with the reduction of Venezuela's ability to get hard currency through the sale of energy products, they've had to look elsewhere for things to gain foreign currency, hard currency with, and a lot of that is in their mining sector, gold mining, precious metals, and much of that mining comes from very sensitive environmental locations in the Amazon basin, and it's a hard place to get to. Certainly, it's a lawless area, but if you look at satellite photos, or if you look at photos of folks who've been on the ground, it is like a moonscape. It's a huge story that nobody talks about. When we think about the Amazon, of course, we think about Brazil, but we have to remember that this whole economic and political model in Venezuela isn't just a human tragedy, it's also an environmental tragedy. And I think as the Biden administration comes into office and clearly focuses on things like global climate change and environmental issues, this is going to be one of the things that will continue to get their attention as well in terms of what Venezuela is doing to its own biosphere. So that's a real complication. And then I think the second thing is, what's a possibility of a transition? The baseline is at this point, Maduro stays in power until he doesn't. He's not going to agree to free and fair elections. And I don't see the international community resorting to the use of force. So within those two extremes, you have to come up with other plausible scenarios that would lend to Maduro willfully leaving office. There aren't a whole lot that, anybody can come up with scenarios, but there aren't a lot that are necessarily that realistic. I think one of them, though, is, and it's not really based on the opposition much at all, and that is people power. At what point do the people of Venezuela just say, we can't survive like this anymore, we can't exist like this anymore? At what point does the equivalent of the Tunisian fruit seller in Caracas just say, I can't do this anymore, and that literally or figuratively lights a spark that creates a public uprising? Because we have to remember the Maduro regime at this point does not control its national territory. It controls Caracas. It controls the security forces. But if there was a true national uprising, it would be very difficult for the central government to maintain control, at least according to some observers. So I guess, scenarios, gaming, it's going to be a cottage industry here going forward because it is a very important aspect, but the baseline continues to be the baseline, which is to say, as you put it, status quo.
Well, the environmental issue we could spend a month talking on. I feel like the environment has never been a major issue in Venezuela. You've had oil floating on the surface of Lake Maracaibo for years. Yeah. And certainly I think permitting for example, has never been as complicated and is sort of an intrinsic of a process as it is in Colombia, for example. Community relations, compare Colombia to Venezuela, it's night and day. So your environmental issue certainly is something that I hope the international community will push. Look, I think that we all expect the Biden administration to take a more multilateral approach to Venezuela. When I talk to people in Washington and inside the US government, I've heard a number of times, Biden will use a carrot and stick approach as opposed to Trump's stick approach. I think that's interesting. But what you and I talked about yesterday, Eric, and I'd like maybe, I don't know how much time we have, but I think maybe you could close with this. What factors in Washington are going to limit Biden's ability to approach different strategies on Venezuela? I mean, I think Cuba, there's Cuba, there's Russia, there's China. Biden's going to dramatically change strategy with these countries, Turkey being another one. How much can he really change? And can he influence Cuba and Russia enough to get them to back off a little bit?
I mean, there are several limiting factors potentially. The first is just the overwhelming weight of the agenda that Biden inherits. COVID, economic recovery, economic stimulus packages, immigration reform, which is going to be a priority and is already announced, getting your government confirmed and in place. I mean, just an overwhelming number of things, even more so than normal because of in my personal view, the incredible policy deficit that he inherits from the Trump administration. And that's just on the domestic side, right? On the international side, there's a whole lot of things that we could refer to. Where does Venezuela fit into that aspect? And so, does he want to use a lot of political will early on to change or to address or to modify Venezuela policy somehow? So I think that's one mitigating factor. I think a second mitigating factor is the election results from November 3rd. Rightly or wrongly, I think wrongly, but rightly or wrongly, the election in Florida turned in part on the idea that the Biden administration would somehow turn and support Maduro and Castro. I mean, I think that's silly, but it was part of the narrative. And so there were a couple Democratic members, not Republican, but Democratic members of Congress who actually lost their seats. Donna Shalala, a very senior member of the Democratic Party for many years, and Debbie Marcus Powell, who was the first Ecuadorian American ever elected to Congress. People notice those things. There's nothing that focuses the mind more in politics than when your own job is at risk. And so the question is from the Democratic Party, not necessarily the Republicans, is this worth it, right? If we're going to be losing our seats, is it really worth it to take on this issue? I think that's an open question. Some would say yes, some would say we need to think about that pretty hard. Not to say that Congress hasn't shifted, it has to the Democratic Party, but you still have some very important voices in place in leadership positions in both parties that would try to prevent dramatic changes. And then I think the final point, I know Miguel is trying to break in here, but the final point is that many of the sanctions, for example, that have been placed on Venezuela don't have anything to do with energy or sectoral sanctions or anything like that. They're placed on individuals for criminal acts like drug trafficking, like crimes against humanity, like human rights abuses, like gross corruption. And in some cases they're indictments, in other cases they're sanctions, but you can't just turn those off because it's not like the criminal activity is now it just goes away. It doesn't. And that's not something that I think any government would necessarily have a lot of flexibility to try to shift. So there are some things that have kind of been locked in. And look, the Trump administration just today put on another round of sanctions on certain individuals in Venezuela, as well as shipping companies, et cetera. So it'll take a while to unwind those to the extent the Biden administration even wants to unwind it. And I would make the case that it doesn't want to, at least in the near term. So yeah, there'll be some shifts. There'll be some toing and froing about negotiations and this sort of thing. But at the end of the day, I think that we're going to see actually a lot of similarity going forward in terms of US policy toward Venezuela, at least in the near term.
Excellent. Hi, Miguel. How much time do we have left?
We are running out of time, but just some closing comments, and yeah, we can move to the last session of the.
Well, I see a comment here in the chat box about the potential for clean technologies, and I think so. Eric already mentioned the need for diversification of the economy away from oil. Fully agree with that. I think oil's got another good 30 years left max to be really profitable if they can get it ever off the ground again. Here the comment talks about millions and millions of cubic feet of wasted gas, both onshore and offshore. Well, I think we're actually talking about billions. Our calculations are that Venezuela is wasting about 2.4 BCF a day of natural gas, which is mostly flared in and vented in eastern Venezuela. The opportunities for gas collection are enormous, and the monetization of that gas for power generation and for industrial use is something that needs to be seriously taken into consideration. And if you folks up in Alberta have any good ideas, I'm sure that we know people that would be interested to hear about them. As let's be realistic. We don't know when there's a regime change happening, but people are today planning for the future.
Absolutely, absolutely, David. Thank you very much to both of you. And I think we are having here in Alberta a great Venezuelan community, of course. A great hope that Venezuela is going to be better at some point. We have been following Venezuela for some time, and our hopes are there, and we are there, and we understand this humanitarian crisis as well. I have a conversation with the ambassador here, Orlando Vieira, and he was commenting on this big issue that is the humanitarian portion that you mentioned, Eric. And with that, I want to thank you very much. It was a very, very interesting conversation on Venezuela.
Thanks again, Miguel.
David and Eric. And now I would like to go to the last part of this full morning. Because thank you very much to everybody that is with us still, because we have a great morning. But we would like to close. We invite Eric to have a conversation. It's a keynote presentation basically on the US in the Americas under the new administration. So Eric, just the floor is yours, okay?
Well, Miguel, again, thank you. The last time I was with you, it was in person in Calgary, and it was in the midst of a blizzard, if you recall that. And as much as I appreciated the invitation, I wished you could have done it at a different time of year. But nonetheless, it's the same time of year now, but we've got it virtually, so I don't have to fight the weather. But nonetheless, your invitation is always warm, and your welcome is always very much appreciated. So thank you for that. I think that probably your audience would be very receptive if I tell them I'm not going to take the full 30-minute time period. I can filibuster. I'm from Washington. I can fill as much time as you want me to, but I'm going to cut it back a little bit. Try to do this in about 15 minutes or so, and try to get you back on schedule a little bit, and just hit the highlights. I know you've had a very full morning and a very rich conversation. Some of it I was privileged to be able to listen to. So I want to respect everybody's time and certainly attention spans as well. So let me just mention a couple primary points about the Biden administration approach to the Western Hemisphere, things I think that we can anticipate seeing and looking forward to. The first is that you're going to see, you've already seen an immediate change in tone. The tone is going to go from rapists and murderers, which we heard a lot about in the previous administration, to partnership, to working together, mutual interests, working with allies and friends. It's a shift, it's a rhetorical shift, and what does it mean in reality? Well, that's the next question, but I think the first step is to change the language and the rhetoric around some of these issues, and I think that's an important step. The second thing I would say is that we have to put Latin America and the Western Hemisphere into a broader overall approach. And that approach would be something that I think is going to be very clear from the priorities that the Biden administration has already announced. Many of these issues will directly impact the Western Hemisphere, although they're not directly Western Hemisphere issues, or solely Western Hemisphere issues, let me put it that way. The first is obviously trying to get our arms around this COVID crisis, which continues to explode around the United States, as well as the world. But from the US president perspective, we have to get it under control within our own borders. That will occupy the president as it should, as well as economic recovery. That's going to be a very strong priority, but we also have to recognize that the world is an integrated place. And unless we can help get other countries get their own COVID crisis under control and their own economies to recover, that will impact us as people travel to the United States, as Americans travel abroad, and certainly in the economic relationships we have with other countries. If other markets are suffering, then ours will too. So these are issues that I think have a global perspective, even if our focus is domestic. Second, we know that the focus and international focus will be on global climate change. The appointment of former Secretary of State John Kerry is a critically important signal, not just as a special envoy for global climate change, but the fact now that he has a cabinet level appointment and a mandate to integrate these issues into virtually everything the United States does on foreign policy. Again, this is a global issue by definition, but it will directly impact, for example, energy suppliers like Venezuela, countries with sovereignty over portions of the Amazon like Brazil or Peru or Bolivia or Venezuela, Colombia, etc. It's also going to impact things like clean energy usage and all the things you've been talking about all morning, but this will clearly have an impact on the Western Hemisphere. The third priority, and you're going to see an announcement as early as tomorrow, but certainly this week, will be on immigration. The effort of the United States to reverse much of the Trump administration's moves on immigration, to liberalize the approach, to give a path to citizenship for the so-called dreamers. And I say so-called because it's just a term of art, and also to change the asylum provisions, return them to what they were, lift the caps on migrants coming to the United States, end the restrictions on travel from predominantly Muslim nations. So you're going to see a lot of changes along those lines. Obviously, again, global issue, but it directly impacts Mexico, Central America, Caribbean basin, and many of the countries of South America as well. So these will be issues that will fall into place along those lines. You're going to see a more robust approach on the support of human rights. You've already seen, for example, even over the last couple days, incoming Biden administration advisors tweeting and saying things publicly about the arrest of Navalny in Russia and some of the high-profile issues that they've taken on human rights. This has been an issue that has largely been put to the side by the Trump administration. It's going to find new voice under the Biden administration, and that will have an impact in certain countries in the Western Hemisphere. And I think something that we have to look for as a priority issue. I think the fifth issue will be trade. Trade policy under a Biden administration will focus primarily on enforcement. And the top two issues will be China, because China is going to be central to almost everything that's done in the foreign policy world going forward. But secondly, trying to make USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement work. That was a big bipartisan success. It was implemented on July 1st of this last year. But in order to expand trade further, they have to show that the current trade model works. So there's going to be a lot of emphasis on enforcement of existing provisions that will directly impact primarily the relationship with Mexico, but also Canada as well. But those are going to center on labor and environmental provisions and some of the regulatory issues. Obviously, the energy issues, which you've been discussing in the last panel on Mexico discussed, will also be part of those discussions. They're not always going to be easy discussions. They could be, in some ways, very difficult to have. But nonetheless, that's part of the broader trade agenda, I think, for the United States. So those would be some of the top international priorities. And then the way to address them, I think the Biden administration is going to make a very intentional effort to try to do so with countries that see the world in a similar way, like-minded countries, we often say. Those would be traditional democracies in Europe, the G7 countries, certainly including Canada, certainly including Japan, and also countries globally that broadly see the world in similar terms, working together with those countries to address the bigger issues, for example, China, for example, global climate change issues, and some of the other issues as well in the Western Hemisphere context that will imply, for example, a broader effort to try to bring regional focus to Venezuela, European focus to Venezuela, not just a United States thing, but also in addressing some of the other issues like COVID, a regional focus, not just the expectation that the United States could or should do this on its own. So I think the approach is also going to change, not just the tone, not just the issues, but also the approach. And then a couple comments about Latin America specifically, if I can, in the couple minutes that I think remain. You know, you're going to, despite our recent conversation on Venezuela, you're going to start hearing more about the broader hemisphere. Clearly, Mexico is going to be part of that discussion, Brazil, South America, less on the troika of tyranny, which is how the Trump administration designated Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, and really was a primary focus of hemispheric policy, and much more on a regional approach with the largest economies, of course, being Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina in order, and trying to put these other more difficult issues not to the side, but try to recognize that the hemisphere is a much bigger place, and that neglecting the bigger agenda only gives an open door, for example, to other countries outside the region, most notably China, but others as well, to take advantage of a lack of US engagement or direct participation in some of the economic and financial and investment issues in the hemisphere. So I think that's something that we're going to hear more of. You're going to see much more of a focus on Mexico. In part, that's because the relationship between the United States and Mexico is changing. I think many observers got it exactly wrong at the beginning of the Trump administration, or more accurately, at the beginning of the Lopez Obrador administration in 2018, when we suggested that, in fact, the two presidents would have a terrible relationship. In fact, they had a pretty solid relationship based on mutual interest, and they seemed to understand each other. They seemed to actually like each other, and they respected each other's politics. We're seeing that shift already. The whole Cienfuegos issue with Mexico and the United States, some of the comments that have been made from Mexico's officials in recent days, and some of the issues certainly on energy that you've been talking about again, and also on the trade agenda. These are going to come up and be much more complicated in the days ahead. My own personal view is that you have to get the relationship with Mexico right if you want to have a broader, successful Western Hemisphere policy, because many American citizens, US citizens, look at Latin America through the prism of Mexico. I'm not saying it's right or good or the best or whatever it is. I'm saying that that's generally how it is. I grew up in Chicago, and Chicago has a huge Mexican and Mexican-American population. And your first contact generally with a Latin American person might be in school or at work or somebody you would interact with. And that tends to be the mindset that a lot of people have. So if the relationship with Mexico works, there tends to be a different approach in the broader United States. Certainly some communities are different, but that is one way to look at it. So Mexico is going to be an important issue going forward. Central America is directly related to that because of the immigration issues. And you've heard already the idea that the Biden administration will seek to obtain a $4 billion package of development for Central America. In part, this will be to help reduce crime. It'll also be to help reconstruct after the very devastating hurricanes, Eta and Iota, from just this last couple months, as well as to help create sustainable development in the region so that Central Americans find it more attractive to remain in their own countries instead of make the very dangerous trip to the United States and increase some of the migration pressures that are faced at the southwest border. So it's a longer term strategy, but I think Central America is once again going to come back to the focus for Washington. Certainly not the way it was in the 1980s or 90s, but much more in the way of development focus and trying to build a sustainable economy for the region. Brazil and Colombia, I think, are two countries that people are going to have to watch very carefully. because the politics here don't align as well as perhaps they did under the Trump administration. And so I think you're going to see a Biden administration take a stronger position with reference to Colombia in particular in terms of the full implementation of the peace accords, in terms of human rights issues. Colombia, of course, has an election in 2020, and that could be a very hotly contested election. So there's going to be a lot of attention paid to Colombia in the days ahead. And then, of course, Brazil. And Brazil is a country that, Miguel, we really need to spend a whole separate discussion in terms of U.S. foreign policy with Brazil. But this is a country that has made common cause with the Trump administration and will face a completely different approach with the Biden administration, much more focus on environmental issues, as we've talked about, focus on some of the social issues that Brazil struggles with, as does the United States, and looking to have a different discussion between the United States and Brazil. My hope is that in the midst of some of those changes, that the broader economic realities of the United States and Brazil remain a focus as they have over the last several months, and could be a continuing aspect, should be a continuing aspect. Brazil is a strategic player globally, and I really think that the United States and Brazil have to do what we can to maintain a sense that we are mutually important. And we might not agree with everything that this official or that official says, and that's understandable, but we have broader national interests, and I think we need to keep those in mind too, and really shape and mold those in a way that is most beneficial to our citizens. But I do think that Colombia and Brazil are going to have a slightly, or in some ways, significantly different approach than what they currently have. And then I think, Miguel, you could go into issues like democracy development, counter-narcotics, some of the sector-specific issues. Some of those will change too, but at the end of the day, Washington is going to focus on what Washington does, on what interested parties are pushing, in what the issue of the day is, particularly emergencies or crises. And much of the policy toward the Western Hemisphere is really a management brief, right? Make sure that things don't get so far out of control that it has to occupy the time of the White House or senior leaders. I've seen that personally from my days in the White House and my days in the State Department and elsewhere. And so we have to assume that that will, in part, be some of the mandate as well going forward. It's going to be interesting times. That's something we can say for certainty. Everything else is speculation, but we look forward to seeing what transpires. I want to thank you again for the invitation. Hopefully that gave you some sense, at least, of how Washington may be looking at the region going forward. If we get back together in a year from now, we can see if anything that I said actually turned out to be true. Look forward to it.
Absolutely, absolutely, Eric. No, we are very optimistic about the future of the relationship of the USA with Canada and with the Americas. We have this announcement tomorrow of the Keystone project as well, right? That is going to be canceled. It's an issue but I think there are going to be different opportunities. And with that, I want to really, really thank you, and to you and to all the speakers that worked with us today. It was a great morning. We start very early, and I'm sure everybody is hungry to go for lunch right now. But just to remind you that we are having our series of events with ¿Qué pasa in Latin America? And we are going to be focusing to go more in depth in the conversation with different countries, that even that the ones that we touched today and others that we didn't touch today, like Ecuador, Peru, Chile. There are a lot to discuss about Latin America. And finally, to thank you, SMPS Professional Services, that was our sponsor today. Thank you very much for that. And stay tuned. Thank you very much, and see you soon. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you, Eric. See you soon. Bye.